Good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
Hello. Good morning.
Sorry.
That's all right. It's 9:30, so I think we've got a pretty full day ahead of us. So it'd be good to start. Welcome staff from councillors. We will be joined online by Deputy Mayor Quentin Smith, and we have a couple of apologies for lateness from Councillor Wong and King. Councillor King, thank you. There we go. And I think there are some people that might need to drop in and out for a couple of pre-arranged meetings, so please don't take anything personally if people walk away. This is
your life?
this is a public workshop. It is being recorded. Obviously, we'll pause the recording. We'll have a couple of breaks during the day. But I'm assuming councillors have had a chance to look at the slide deck and the briefing materials.
Record number of attachments, I think.
Yeah. I just
It's a record.
Well, at least attachments. Well, we're not going to do a quiz on attachment F, but I mean, at least hopefully everyone's got an idea what we're talking about today. You know? So I'm going to hand over to Penny to guide us through what should be a really interesting day.
Well, yes, as John noted, there were a lot of attachments. So there's a couple of context-setting pieces that I just wanted to do before handing to Carrie to talk about the submission process. So obviously there's a lot of reforms happening at the moment. We've touched on some of them through the induction processes. Those reforms are going to have some wide-reaching implications on the council in terms of, you know, what we do, what we look like in the future, and these reforms also have significant implications for our LTP planning process. So what we're doing today is talking specifically about a subset of those reforms where the government is currently consulting on feedback on them and for the purposes of informing a submission. So this session isn't going to be talking about all of the reforms and how they all interact. Part of that is because some of this stuff has only just dropped, so and some of it's not even close to final. We're at exposure drafts and informal consultation processes, so there's still quite a lot of water to go under the bridge. But as we start to get into the LTP discussion starting in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking to you about how they start to come together in the way that we need to think about long-term planning and how we need to think about reforming the way that we operate as a council going forward. So the items we're talking about today, each of the items is intended to be an opportunity for you to start getting your heads across what the change is and what the change is proposed, so that you can start thinking about that to inform those future conversations. But the reason that we're having them all now on, you know, one of the early, the first work, well, no, it's not even the first workshop of the year, you guys came back working hard. A very early session in the year is because there are submissions due on all of these items. So there's kind of a twofold. It's to start getting you across what the proposed changes are, but today's session is really about getting content for a submission. And what you'll see is that this is, well, for those of you who were on, who are returning councillors, this is a different approach than we've taken for submissions in the past, and I'll hand to Carrie to talk about this, but this is an approach where we're giving you all the information that we have and giving quite a bit of time for you to think about that, talk about that, and to provide us with your views on how you want to focus the submission. Obviously on some of these, like the rates capping one, where the submission is due on the 4th of February, we have done some thinking already to make sure that we've got something ready to send to you after this meeting, but that will be adjusted based on what you your feedback today, and the other areas it's a lot earlier in the process. So, but I'll hand to Carrie to anything else you want to talk about with that.
No, I won't repeat what she said. Obviously, lots of different functions, objectives for today, reform program as a whole, implications down the road, the degree to which a submission is needed on them, And finally, also signaling, before I look after some other housekeeping matters, that this Thursday will be the first workshop with councillors on the approach to advocacy by the council for the triennium. So today is a really good scene setter for what we have in front of us to decide where are we going to focus on and what form are we going to focus on. So to the degree to which you have a light bulb moment go off in relation to something, put a pin in that, because we'll come back to that on Thursday. Today we really need to focus on each of the specific proposals. These are running in real time, as you well know. We generally try to get you guys drafts at least 4 to 5 days ahead to provide feedback. We will do our best, but just giving you the heads up that that may not be the case with all of them. Rates capping will be coming out first for you. That's the first one that's due 4th of Feb. 13th of Feb, we have the RM replacement ledge, and then the 20th of Feb, IFFA development levies and simplifying local government. So signaling that the turnaround here, given when this is all happening, will be tight. The last point before turning it over to simplifying local government is around a proposal that's not up on the screen, and that's the emergency management bill. It is really important for the council, but we've established that a really, really thorough submission was done on the discussion paper last year, and a lot of those points have been incorporated into the bill. There is a Otago CDEM submission that's occurring that does this at a high level, so that's what the council is going to sort of be attaching on to this submission, rather than doing its own. So it's actually a really valuable example of where staff have been involved in this policy process really early on in the piece and had influence. At this point, it's not necessary for us to go out and draft a specific submission, and Councillor Mitchell is on that committee and will be inputting into that as well. So you're all over that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say. So would be great if we could try to keep to those indicative timings. Really grateful for your time, but we also have subject matter experts that are sort of timed to come in to speak to their item as we've outlined. So if we can try to hold to that, that would be awesome. Other than that, I will hand it over to Campbell, who's going to lead the session on simplifying local government.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, kia ora koutou. I'll take the slide deck mainly as read, but I'll just go through it for the purposes of discussion, as Annie has mentioned. So just as a bit of a background, the local government simplification is justified based on a local government reform program, which is quite wide. The reason why kind of bringing the attention to this is that these 4 pillars are essentially what is underpinning what the government wants to change in local government. The first 2 ones, decision-making and systems and processes. So setting clear roles and responsibilities for local government, saving time, balancing different principles, and systems and processes are the 2 areas where the local government simplification is probably focusing on. So that's just kind of as an overarching justification. The attachment, which has the policy proposal, also uses the justification that the system is complex, confusing and costly, in their words, and there's a duplication of governance roles, and RM reforms require review anyway, so it's good timing to go through these reforms. And so those are the proposals that they use in the proposal, but these are kind of linked to these first 2 as well. So
I think just to add to that, you'll see on the A3 that sits behind this that all of the reforms can kind of be linked through to these pillars. So when we start talking about the LTP, you'll see a lot of the, and we'll touch on this when we talk about each of these things individually today, but each of these reforms has an implication for how we think about what councils need to deliver in the future and how we pay for it. And there's multiple different aspects to that. So we're going to talk about rates capping, we're going to talk about the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, development levies, all of those are changing, and they're all kind of underpinned by the resource management changes and the local have done well changes, as well as the system improvements changes that then drive what services we deliver and how we focus where we deliver.
Yeah. So yeah, they're a package essentially. Think of them as a package. They're all working together, and that's how they're thinking about it in the central government. Apparently.
They're not quite as much a package as they would like
No.
to make
Yeah.
out. They're largely a set of disparate actions by individual ministers that the system and the public need to try and read as a package,
Yes.
but actually central government needs to learn to read them as a package as well, because at the moment, and certainly going into Christmas, they weren't a package. They were simply just a random set of, not entirely random, but they were just a set of discrete, distinct changes.
I can confirm that, having been in Wellington a fortnight ago and met with players, and you think they were on different pages of both.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the things they're trying to achieve through what that they are asking us to do are directly at odds with each other.
Yeah.
But what we have to do is they all influence how we have to plan for what we do and how we pay for it. So we have to find a way to make those work.
Can I just ask a question? Have they got any, I mean, they won't have regulatory impact statements yet, I wouldn't imagine, if there's no bills out, but they do?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what do they say about and do they talk about the package?
No, they've got
So
individual regulatory
they stay
impact
in their
statements.
individual lane as well? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So there's no guidance on the,
So the regulatory impact statement for rates capping, for example, was one of the additional attachments that was sent out last week. That was proactively released things. Well, I mean, this is all of the material about rates capping that they dropped on Christmas Eve. So yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So they don't have a big picture guidance on, that's concerning, right? So,
As Mike points out, they're not looking at it from a system perspective necessarily. They're thinking about certain components as a system. So everything they link to system improvements for local government. So rates capping, the system improvements bill, simplifying local government. You can see they're trying to actively look at that as a package,
right.
but they're not they're not effectively layering on the impacts of local water done well, RMA reforms, or the impact of having this mega ministry that's going to be responsible for all of those things. That might have a positive outcome in the future because they will be able to coordinate it, but they're not looking at it in a coordinated way at the moment.
Thank you.
But we have to try and do that.
Well, yeah, and I think the other point to make is that particularly some of the, not so much the legislation, it's obviously that is actually a defiant piece of government policy, but everything else, I don't think the system, and certainly my reading isn't, I'm not convinced that they know what the outcome will be.
No.
It feels a little bit like they've tossed the ball in the air and said, well, when it comes down, it'll be better, but we don't know where it will land, what shape it will land in, and you know how it will bounce. So I think that again, to the point that's been made, it's not as though there is a grand outcome or a grand plan. There's not even that they really have a shape of local government. They just, and the simplification of local government is the perfect example. It's complex, it's wrong, it can be better.
Just like the government theory, just shake it up and the market will determine a positive result.
Thanks, Mike.
I guess the opportunity for us in this is to put all of those things together in a way that is going to enable us to get the best outcomes for our community, because that they are the changes that are in front of us. So, yeah.
So in instance of the vision, we'll create our own and then say that's what we want.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So I'll just quickly go through back to simplification. So step one, as you would have seen in the proposal, is to replace regional councils, which is with the CTB. There are questions regarding the throwing up and what's going to land in there about the voting on the CTB, so the mayoral powers on that. And they put through a series of options, which you would have seen as well. You could essentially have to balance voting powers on this CTB. They've asked for opinions about what they would, the preferred option would be. We can go through them in detail later on, maybe, but this is just step one. Essentially, they're replacing the governance of regional councils. And then step two would be to have, sorry.
On step one, they have put forward, so their preferred option is this board made up of all of the mayors from across the region, and it replaces the regional council. So the regional council will go, and this board then governs the regional council activities until step two is completed. They've put in two other options that they considered, that they want feedback on. One is that there is the CTB is made up of Crown Commissioners totally, so they just send in some Crown Commissioners to both replace the ORC, in our case ORC councillors, and lead the regional reorganisation process. And the other alternative option that they've discussed in their papers is that you have the CTB as described, but then there is also a Crown Commissioner on that group, presumably with the view to ensuring that the group is thinking about the things that government wants them to think about.
Babysitter.
Yeah, and there's various options for how that Crown Commissioner can vote in terms of what they've put forward.
Yes, they're listed in that.
So Penny, for our CTB, which councils are we talking about? Does it include Waitaki? Is Waitaki covered by Otago Region?
That would be unclear because it's split. I think they might sit on both.
Yeah, they have.
Yeah, they have to sit on both Canterbury and Otago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know how many times they have suggested that these mayors will meet physically in a place? Because I thought they said it was sort of assumed that they would do the same thing as the regional council does and meet to discuss. I just don't understand how. Is there anything in the regulatory stuff that maybe I've missed where they talk about how that's even practical?
The practicality does not seem to have been considered by them. We met with DIA representatives who went through this with us, and that did not appear to have been something that was considered by ministers at least.
I get the sense that they're setting that option, that democratic option up to fail because it's literally impractical.
Yeah.
The model that kind of works though is the regional transport committees and the CDM group joint committees, which are regional, and they meet generally quarterly, and they get a bit of stuff done, but not much. And it's a conservative model, which might be the intention. So.
The other thing that we'll get to in a second is that one of the things that's happening through this process is government is reviewing what functions sit with regional council, with the view that some things will be pulled back to national government level, central government level. And so it could be informed by the fact that they think they're going to strip a whole lot of things out, so there won't be as much to govern. But yet the intent is certainly, it doesn't appear to be that the CTB would do less than what the regional councillors currently do, unless the regional council does less because they strip these functions out.
Yeah, so that probably is the step two, which is essentially is a rapid review on all regional council functions. So those will be taken out. So we'll find out when that would look like, probably later in the year. And so the role of these CTBs is to create a regional reorganisation plan. They have 2 years to create this, and they do have to publicly consult on this as well. That might be consultation as well, so it's quite a tight time frame. And the minister has the final decision. They are advised by the local government commission, but ultimately the decision does sit with the minister. They specifically say not referendums.
And that 2 years starts from when the legislation is enacted, which is the same time frame from when the CTBs need to be stood up. So essentially the legislation comes in, you have to set up the CTB immediately, and you have 2 years from that date to do the regional reorganisation plan. We have. John has.
Maybe. How does that time frame overlap or align with the time frame for regional spatial plans?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Well,
And
it hasn't been designed to align with it, I don't think.
I don't think
No.
So you'd have a regional reorganisation happening at the same time another group are doing a regional spatial plan. And just to be clear, the regional reorganisation is just within the current regional council boundaries. So there would be no sort of look for us considering Northern Southland or those sort of things that you would probably think about in a real review of district councils.
I'm pretty sure it's not constrained by the regional boundaries. So the CTBs are region-based, but they can work with other CTBs to look at whether there are, synergies that might occur over a bigger region. You might end up with a sub-regional split within a region where part of your reorganisation plan, for example, might be that, Queenstown should be what do you call it, Alan? Principality, and everybody else should go together. It could be that you have 2 unitary authorities. It could be that you join together with Southland and have 1 mega something. So that there's lots of options available in terms of how the future areas would be split. That's what I understand.
So it was, my reading was it's not just about replacing the regional council.
No.
Government's expecting district councils to join up as well. That's what they see.
Oh yes, so the regional reorganisation plan is not just about what happens to regional councils. It is a review of all of the functions of district and regional councils and what is the best way to organise them in the future.
So I think there is a big risk in the way that the model, and we haven't seen what the model is, right? No. This is just a discussion paper, and it won't be legislation or policy until the next government, depending on what government we get. But there is a risk that it ends up being a sort of a do minimis type approach where you just slam a couple of councils together and that satisfies the least, the lowest common denominator, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You could do that in about 5 minutes. But there is that opportunity, and the risk is you miss the opportunity to do something much more comprehensive. And, we know that in Southland, we've got Southland District has got a reorganisation proposal that's currently being considered by the Local Government Commission, but that's not supported by any of the other councils that have been wrapped up in that. So, there is great opportunity in here if structured correctly, but there's also a big risk that if it is done in a very sort of once over lightly, what you could get is actually the worst of all outcomes. And I mean, I think, Nikki, you said, suggested the model feels like it's been designed to fail. I think you're certainly right. It's much more challenging. I mean, it's a model that makes some sense if you're dealing with the Wellington region, or if you're dealing with the Nelson Marlborough region, or even Canterbury to a lesser extent. But it doesn't work for a disparate region like ourselves, or the Waikato, or some of those regions which are very far flung, and where you're trying to draw massive areas and smaller councils together.
And it does have a little bit of a feel similar to the local water done well stuff, where we are going to be giving you the choice of how to structure yourselves. But then when we get to the next stage, I would expect there is actually quite a lot of direction about where they expect that to fall. But at the moment, they certainly, it is a discussion paper, they certainly are talking like they expect regions to look at a wide range of future delivery models, which might involve shared services or consolidation of certain functions. So not just pushing everything together, like what are a range of delivery models that would give the best outcomes from an efficiency perspective. They're very focused on efficiency.
I should say, do they talk in the papers anywhere about if this group of mayors are carving up, dicing and slicing, where's the mandate, or where's the governance, or the I know that there'll be engagement, but I mean, I don't have I wasn't elected on a mandate to decide which bits of which council go where. So do they speak to how they see that would happen?
I think the reorganisation plan has to be consulted on.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. But they do speak to the fact that mayors are democratically elected, and people know their mayor more than they know their regional council, which was their justification.
Yeah.
So it's like, the system is complex and confusing. People know their mayor, they should make the decision whether that's the correct rationale.
Yeah, but that's true, but they weren't elected for that purpose.
Yes.
And it's turkeys voting for Christmas, because the objective is to not remove regional government. That's the rhetoric. The intention is to regionalise local government on small or large regional basis, of which there will then be much fewer mayors and fewer elected members. So, what they say they're doing is not actually the intended outcome. They might not be stating what their intended outcome is, but the obvious outcome is a whole range of unitary authorities, predominantly, which will be significantly more distant from the voters, because there'll be much less democratic component to all of it, and more Wellington control.
Which is why I expect at the next stage, we'll see more structure that drives towards that outcome, because at this stage, they're indicating that the outcome might be you just take the regional council functions and allocate them to individual councils, full stop, or you create a CCO for the regional council functions, which seems wild.
For some key ones, but you
may as well just keep in regional council then.
But then those CCOs may be multi-regional.
Oh yes, multi-regional,
So I think, and I think, we're early days. I think one of the curious things, and I've had a conversation with John about this, is that, this idea that you lop the head off the beast, i.e. the regional councillors, and then basically sort of work out what you do with the body afterwards, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If you want to deal with the body, there's nothing that really stops you keeping the head on for the next 3 years while it works to sort of, kill itself off.
Body operating with a head isn't helpful either, really, is it?
No, well, that's right. Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's where.
Still got a regional council.
I keep thinking about an ant. Like you've got the multi parts of the body, and just chopping bits off and saying, well, we've solved part of it now, and then we'll chop another bit off, which will say these are the bits that go back to central government, and then you can fight over I never was very good at biology, but you can fight over whatever's the last bit of the body. There are different ways, and I think now is the right time, because we know this doesn't have a legislative framework, to say actually, is that the right thing to do? Is it actually just getting rid of the regional councillors, stopping them doing what they need to do for the next 2.5 years, the smartest thing to do? Or do you simply say there's a very strong mandate to reform and actually allow them to continue to do their work? There seems to be a little bit of well, not a little bit, it's a large dose of pure real politique in their sort of headlines about getting rid of the regional council, and then laying a whole lot of extra responsibilities on, in our case, 5 mayors around the region.
On that point, because it did mention there that the councillors may be able to be appointed to regional committees or something. I've read something in there about, is there any role for us in the regional space or not? Because I touched on it and I thought, that's the first I've heard of it. But
I'm not aware.
From my understanding, the CTBs could create committees underneath them, which would be populated by district councillors.
But at which point, are you then saying that weakening the operation of the district councils?
Exactly.
More than just having the mayors.
That's right. More than already distracting the mayors, you're now going to potentially distract district councillors as well. So, I think, if there's a position that council wants to take, and it's really obviously it's up to you. I mean, I think now is the time to say, is that running too quickly down a pathway that could otherwise, be approached differently in a political sense. It isn't quite as politically disruptive, but still aims towards the opportunity for reform, which is clearly where the government does want to go.
And I think what's important to consider is when we get to talking about that and what you might want to submit on, is that they've been pretty clear that they've taken the decision that this approach is being taken, and so what they want feedback on is how to make it practical. And one of the things that cynically has occurred to me is if local government pushes back on having the mayors on these CTBs, they could default to making them commissioners, in which case you've got an even bigger disconnect from the democratic process in communities. So that's just something to consider when we're discussing this, is what is a practical way that you could retain democracy whilst still implementing this.
Okay.
No, I'll be back. I'll be back as soon as I can.
That's enough.
Yep, that's
29 minutes down.
And Penny's right, when we met with DIA, it was very clear they know is not something that'll just go straight to the shredder. They won't be interested.
That's right.
And ironically, they're talking about having less governance, but they're actually also talking about more community boards. So they give an example where 3 councils merge, but you have more community boards. So it is the optics of getting rid of a layer. And nobody cares about community boards because they don't see it as a layer. But I mean, that's the other thing that they do throw into the mix to figure out. But I think the the rush to, as you say, decapitate the governance of that, there's some risks, because if you look at the timelines, then these, as proposed reviews, would be coming up with recommendations 6 months before the end of our triennium. So the mayors and potentially the councils, would end up moving into an election period based on stuff that might not be popular, might not be signed off. So it becomes an election issue within district councils. So that wouldn't be helpful. That's probably quite a significant risk of the process. I mean, to me, logic says if there was an acceptance that it was all going to change, then the time to do that will be at the end of the triennium, rather than 6 months before, or, so that you've actually got everyone who's been elected is in place for their 3-year period, but knowing that during that time, something's going to come along and there'll be a better discussion. That would be my sense. Whether that's fast enough for the government, but I mean, if they just want to say regional councils are going and then not care how that happens or how long it takes, then that might be a sort of pragmatic. So we'll get a much better outcome if we've got more time.
The problem's always been the relationship between local and central, and it's sort of been this very distant thing that has been communicated through the community. A lot of people go to our MP about stuff that's relevant to us, and then we literally got a email from our local MP asking us to spend money on sports fields and other things, when they're also saying to stop wasteful spending or any discretionary spending back to basics. But I think from observation from Sam Broughton as President of Local Government New Zealand, obviously that's now changing leadership. There has been this whole, pageantry of, sit down and have a coffee and we'll talk about it, but there's already this in train and nothing's really going to move it. And in the same way, I guess now there's the opportunity, the contest of ideas. So we come up with a vision and it's, like what we want it to be. I feel like this is a massive opportunity in the same respect, not to sort of like overly dramatize it. If it's about timing, there's an election at the end of this year, central government, they could all flip again. So waiting for the perfect time, I think, is the wrong question. It's what is the perfect outcome in terms of structure, which is where Penny and staff have come to. In the same respect, I think that's a great opportunity to look at things that have been painful previously and go, well, how does it make more sense now? So quite optimistic.
Is there some science at all behind this that you guys think, like the direction they're going in, or have they looked to other countries in the world and see what works better and what works here and things like that? Are you getting that feeling, or is there examples of what best practice would look like for us as New Zealand?
Well, for those of you who were returning councillors, you'll remember the Future for Local Government process, which the previous Labor government had done an extensive piece of work called Future for Local Government. They had a panel with experts from across local government and central government that convened to do this work. They looked at overseas models, they looked at international best practice, they looked at what the situation was in New Zealand, what wasn't working, what was working, why it wasn't working. They did extensive roadshows, talked to everybody in New Zealand about that, and they put out a report essentially saying these are the things that should be considered for a strong future local government system in partnership with central government. And there were a range of changes that they promoted through that. And what this government did when they came in was said, thanks, no thanks, put it in the drawer, and removed all the links from the internet, so you can't actually find that work anymore. But this work is clearly informed by that work, I would say, in terms of, I don't think they've done their own research and work. They've looked at the extensive work that the Future for Local Government panel did, but they've put their own spin on it in terms of choosing to focus on quite a narrow portion of it, which is the structure of local government. So that Future for Local Government work said structure is important, and they essentially said that the current regional council, district council structure is not sustainable and isn't getting the best outcomes. But there were a range of other things that needed to be considered. It had a big focus on place-based services, on direct community involvement in decision making, so democratic, participatory and decision making processes. It talked a lot about the funding split between central and local government, that tax takes have continued to increase as a proportion of GDP, but rates have actually stayed steady or decreased. There was a lot of things in that report. This government has just picked up one part, which is it's more efficient if you group together, essentially.
Yeah,
so
right.
Yes and no, they're picking up, I would say, on extensive work that was done, but a narrow focus, and I don't think they've done significant new work, which is why this stuff is so light in terms of the consultation.
The costs of doing this, because you would expect that if central government wanted to do reform, they might do it themselves. And this way looks like they're giving us the opportunity to create what we want, but within a very narrow band of options. But what's the cost of doing this? Because it would, normally it would come from taxes to sit down and work out, how do you reorganise? But we've got mayors sitting down and staff trying to figure out
So there's no extra costs allocated to this. So their intent appears to be that by getting rid of the regional councillors, the budget associated with having the regional council, the council, gets reallocated to presumably some additional remuneration for the mayors who are working in the CTB and to fund the regional reorganisation. So there's no extra funding.
Right.
It's just intended that the regional council operating costs for the council would fund both the CTB and the regional reorganisation.
I think
So they're making it our problem.
Yeah, I mean, the other issue is this, as Campbell referred to, is the work that's going on now to change some of the services the regional council deliver. So we don't know, and they're not consulting on that.
No.
With anybody, including the regional council. So, which bits may be taken back to the centre, which bits may be shoved off to district councils. And of course, there has to be a funding discussion with both of those as well, because obviously fundamentally changing the rates, we are changing how those rates are split. So that's another dimension that nobody knows the shape of yet or the extent of. So that again, is going to either have to be legislated in a way that allows regional rates to then be directed to pull money in the interim to service these activities. To this stage, they've clearly given no thought about how they're going to execute that change, because there's a massive staff implication for regional councils. We could end up getting more staff, we could end up getting services, we could end up having to restructure our rates to rate for some of these things, because if we think about public transport as the one that possibly is one that they could devolve back to the relevant districts, we have no basis at this point for doing more than we do at the moment, which is simply fund some of the on-street infrastructure. So that has major consequences depending on what they do and how quickly they do it.
I mean, they haven't even made clear whether in that rapid review they would be immediately making those changes or just providing advice for, you must consider this when you do your regional reorganisation. So it could be that they do this rapid review and say these things will come back to central government. We anticipate these things would go to district councils. Consider that when you do your regional reorganisation plan. Or they could say these things are coming back to central government. We're going to take them immediately. Regional council, you sort out how you're going to give us money for that. Everything else stays with you until your regional reorganisation plan is done. So they haven't provided much guidance around how. So I suspect because they don't know yet.
Yeah, and again, I think it's time for us to fill the space in a lot of ways. But when I look at trends around the world in terms of other things that work well, having a share of local sales tax, we're one of the only countries that don't have it. They want to drive growth and economic development, but there's no incentive for us from a finance point of view. When you look at other successful democracies, there's more municipalities, there's more localism in New Zealand. New Zealand's become the most centralised decision-making platform in the OECD. So the irony is they're spinning a rhetoric saying that if you take decision-making away from communities, there's more efficiency. It's an absolute lie. But I think until we actually spread the other rhetoric, which is, big businesses don't end up creating the most direct relationship with their customers and they're not the most efficient or effective, there's a lot of bloat and other stuff. You're better to deliver it close to where the problems are. Then, we have a chance at actually being able to be empowered to solve our own problems. But I look at this and go, their ignorance is a platform for us, like to say, to decide what it is. And it's an opportunity far more than it is, we shouldn't be dismayed by it. It should be like an absolute platform to build what we need.
Yeah, I mean, we want democracy to work. It doesn't feel like they do. I feel like they're setting it up, you know.
Whether they do or don't, this is the opportunity to sort of put our some two pieces into it.
And so I guess the thing for you to think about today is the submission is about what form should that group take who is going to be making decisions for the regional council and for the regional reorganisation plan, and the validity around having a regional reorganisation plan. So in terms of what that regional reorganisation plan might look like or say we should do, that's what happens when we get to that stage in the process. I guess the discussion today is what, as to Cody's point, what sets us up in the best way to get the best outcomes for our community. So what would we think, what do we think, do you think, the CTB or, you know, the group that drives that should look like to get the best outcomes when we do the regional reorganisation plan, assuming that everybody thinks that doing a plan is a good idea. Because that's one of the other questions. Do you think we should do it? I don't know why they even ask, because they're clearly going to ask us to do it.
Well, I think as John said, you know, the discussion we had with the IA before Christmas, that anything that says no, we just want to stay the way we are, we don't want to do something, is just going to be shredded. They're not interested in debating the whether. They're more interested in understanding what the council might say about the how.
I think it has to be yes. I mean, I don't think local government can vote for commissioners.
No.
It's not possible. It doesn't fit with our.
But is there also a mix of regionally elected members? Well, I guess that's regional council.
So I do think the commissioner is a good idea to put in there, one, and whether they vote or not, I don't know, but it would provide that connection between the Crown and, you know, they would see what a reasonable group and how the mayors are trying, you know, the Crown Commissioner has responsibility to report back and say, hey, you guys, it's working, or I don't know, but.
That was my thinking when I read it. I was like, my commissioner could be a good idea, but a non-voting one, so you've kind of got a neutral party. I don't know if they're neutral party, that's probably the wrong word, but.
Neutral to local politics.
Well, exactly, neutral between the mayors, right? You know, like just got another person around the table to, but I would be going for the non-voting commissioner. Would be but that's where my initial thoughts went, and it hasn't really changed after listening today either.
So I think there's two things to talk about. One is the CTB and the makeup of the CTB in terms of driving the regional reorganisation plan. And then there's the CTB with its role of governing the regional council activities in the interim. So I wonder if there are two different ways that they can be done. So I think to your point earlier, Mike, is there a world where you have the CTB that's driving the regional reorganisation plan under, you know, what they've talked about here, but the regional councillors remain through their current term to govern the interim, you know, the regional council activities in the interim, and you have one of the regional council, the chair, as part of the CTB, rather than having the CTB try and govern the regional council as well as do that.
That's a great idea.
It's a great idea, you know.
Wasn't my idea. That's what the
I think the CEs came up.
The CEs came up with this idea, I think, But it seems sensible because the CTB then isn't getting dragged down into the day-to-day of what the regional council is doing now. They're fully focused on the opportunities of the future in terms of what the region can achieve.
But I also think having the chair of the regional as part of that is a really good idea, because that's it's the realm that you're also splitting up in.
That's right.
And if you use your analogy, he'd cut off in it as a graphic, that would be great. I thought that was
I think the timing then becomes really important. You really have to have the regional reorganisation plan approved before you then go into the next triennium. But you're not going to have implemented it immediately. So perhaps then the CTB could transition into governing the regional council as well as, you know, because they're now not developing the
plan
reorganisation plan. That work is done. So then maybe they could step into governing the regional council while you implement the reorganisation plan.
There needs to be transition phases that you can't just
And the government clearly wants to be able to say regional councillors are going at this stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there also needs to be a ton of transitional legislation.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything that's going to amalgamate authorities. I mean, that's going to take a huge amount of parliamentary time.
This is,
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting because the regional councillors don't really cost that much, let's face it. You know, so what is driving them to get rid of them? You've still got the regional council, you've still got governance of the regional council, you're just getting rid of all of the workhorses of governance.
I think it's the intuition from the consumer
It's
or
just,
customer.
it's exactly.
But like,
It's just-
I get this all the time, and people go, oh, okay, Contact Energy had the hardware at a really high, at the highest limit, a storm came and rode some cliffs. Who do we go to hold them to account? And I was like, well, kind of how I see it, because it's environmental, but then there's also, public safety concerns that could be from QLDC as well. I mean, you sort of have, in the same way with all these different land parcels, there is, from a customer point of view, a resident or, citizen, it is quite multifaceted. And I guess from us, when you develop an understanding, it all makes sense. But I think my intuition going into this is, this is a lot to learn, and it's not what you think it would be. So I guess if we keep focus on, the person who doesn't know anything about government, who just sees a problem and wants to see someone who can solve it, I guess that's the sentiment that they're trying to come at it from.
I suspect that, I think the government has been pretty clear that they think the regional councils are making decisions that aren't in the best interests of New Zealand, and they think the implication here is that those decisions are being made by the councillors. That it's not about the system that the regional council is working within legislatively, it's because the councillors are choosing to make those decisions. So that's the implication about why they want to immediately remove the councillors.
Protection of the environment, and if we go the other way, maybe we can undermine it.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the other one, Future for Local Government, why they wanted to remove?
Their basis was a lot more broad. There was a lot of different reasons for why you might look at reform, but they didn't have a structure proposed. It was, I think they had like 8 or 9 different topics, and it's just actually a really interesting read because of the research they did.
Yeah.
So it was a lot more.
It was about moving decision-making closer to communities, because regional councils, some of the decisions that they make are the things that the community cares about the most, but they are the furthest away in terms of local government. So I think that's a lot of the reasoning behind unitary authorities is pushing down. You have a unitary authority at the highest level, but you have a lot more connection at the local levels that feed up into it. Unitary authorities aren't intended to just be a big bubble up here with no connection. You actually have to have the next layer as well, which is where you have more connection to communities for decision making than you have in the current system.
I think
it's a lot more complex.
I think Quentin's got a question. Quentin.
It's moved on a bit, but I was just going to say that the reason that government want to remove the ORC councillor or the regional councillors is very politically motivated. It's been driven by a relatively small number of decisions that have both in Wellington and in Canterbury, particularly, they've highlighted it to the politicians with the power. So it's a very targeted, politically driven motivation. It's got nothing to do with function.
And I suspect that Otago Regional Council in particular has influenced that somewhat. Because government ministers have made very
Otago has definitely been one. I mean, the fact that Shane Jones calls them communists is fairly telling of that. There's one in Canterbury, a decision in Canterbury that's been very prominent, including the nitrate emergency decision. And there's 2 outside of Wellington, which I can't recall the details on, that have been very influential in the political sphere.
All right, so
we could return back to the consultation questions. I feel like we've covered Crown Commissioners regarding the other questions.
On that though, there was a suggestion that having a commissioner on the CTB was seen as useful but not necessarily a voting or veto power holding commissioner. Is that a consistent view held around the table? Does anyone have any different views on that?
I can only talk from my experience in Canterbury when all of the regional councillors were sacked. And we had commissioners brought in who were subject matter experts. And not necessarily politically connected to the government at the time. And it was actually very useful. So, you know, there can be some benefits to this. I think a bit like the regional deal stuff, having someone as we have there with Connor English, who's able to act as an interface, would actually be quite useful, and it would potentially diffuse some of the tension that might be there otherwise. I think it could be a useful addition to just, rather than just having the mayors, because that's going to be hard work.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're not in support of having a full board of commissioners, but that we think having a commissioner on the board with the mayors would be a useful addition.
There's an element here, I mean, what's coming out of this is, at some level, we have to do a bit of gaming of the system. And if you have no commissioner at all, it's basically a middle finger to central government. Whereas we really don't know how this is going to shake out in the future. So yeah, I agree with you. A commissioner non-voting means that we are going forward with the process, but we actually don't know where that process is going to land. So it makes sense.
And we certainly don't want a voting commissioner or a veto power commissioner.
I think principally having a voting commissioner is undemocratic as well, and there's a lot of political rhetoric to say that you shouldn't put people who don't have the authority of the community in there.
I think the nuance there is the difference between a commissioner who may not be voting, but a commissioner that is more than an observer. Observer-only commissioners aren't particularly useful to anybody. They do feel a bit like, you know,
Advisory commissioner.
yeah, so they need to be advisory in their role, because you do want to make that strong connection back to the centre. And I mean, it's hard to imagine that the government wouldn't want to see expert commissioners at some level through most of these, because they'll want to keep some level of direction on it. So yeah, I agree, you may not want them voting, but you want them to be more than just observers on the process.
So I think verbalising what we would want the role of that individual to be, what's the purpose to have him there, would be really, really helpful in terms of maintaining that link with Central. So there need to be probably somebody who's across the policy or the ministerial sort of briefs, of which there are many impacting this. And then just to the question of whether we feel we should add that the chair of the regional council should also be part of that transition board.
So I think there seemed to be broad agreement that we should be setting out that we support the role of a CTB to drive the regional reorganisation, but that we think the regional council should remain to the end of the triennium to focus on the delivery of regional council, so that the CTB can fully focus on the regional reorganisation, but with the addition of the regional council chair. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
Because regional councils are not involved in the panel that's doing the redesign at the moment, are they?
No.
No, because they've got.
No, they're not. I don't even think they're being told how it's working.
At what point would we do some work on what regions and areas we want to be involved in and we want to control?
I think that would be the work of the CTB to say, as part of the regional reorganisation plan, should we be talking to our neighbours or our other growth councils, growth areas?
But that's the CTB, that's the mayors and a commissioner and a ORC person. I'm talking about us deciding which way we want to go as a Queenstown, Wanaka district council as to which regions we want to actually go with. I don't actually know whether I want to leave it to the CTB to decide that, and then for us to then be told these are the regions you're going to be.
And I don't think that's the case.
I'm trying to understand how it works.
CTB will be to, I guess, lead the reorganisation plan process.
Yeah.
But the plan itself is going to involve every council. It's going to involve every councillors.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that the mayors who are on that board would be mandated as well. So, and that's going to be the challenge. How do you mandate one person when you're thinking about multi-area things? But I mean, that's the only way. I mean, it shouldn't be down to what I feel like first thing in the morning, which is not always going to be the best outcome.
No,
So,
each council, I would hope, would have the opportunity to participate in that process and provide their advice into it.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm getting to, is if we look at it and we go, right, we want to partner with Southland because geographically it makes better sense.
Yep.
The need is too further away, let's do that. At what point do we make some decisions on that? And is that the time that we would be presenting to the CTB for the purposes of finalising or then considering a reorganisation plan?
So I think I'd need to look into this, but it's a good question actually, whether once the CTB comes up with a regional reorganisation plan, they are required to consult on it and they make the decision. I don't think the individual councils then make a decision about what happens to their council in the future. The CTB has mandated the decision making. That's the implication from this. We haven't got legislative, but that's what I implied from this. Is that what the discussions you've been part of, Mike, have indicated?
Yeah, I actually, honestly, I don't know that they've really thought that far down the train track.
Yeah.
But I think, again, it's something that, I think this particular submission gives us an opportunity to simply raise some of those questions, even if they don't necessarily raise an answer, but to raise it. Because fundamentally, if you think that this is being foisted upon us, then what presumably we want is to be able to create the best opportunity to get the best outcome, particularly if we're talking about, system change that will be here for 50 years. So 89 was the last big reorganisation. So actually getting it right rather than doing it conveniently.
Well, that's the thing, and my concern is you've got your CTB, which is five years, a commissioner and an ORC person. John's only one vote of that, and all of a sudden you get outvoted on some regional plan, regional reorganisation.
And they've got
we don't
discussions
like.
about whether it's on population basis or whatever. I mean,
because that's what I was
They
thinking,
have-
the voting was part of
They have
this.
talked about the role of the local government commission in this, and talked about beefing that up to assist. So I'm not sure whether the government would ever allow any group of mayors to finally be the decision-making body. So I suspect that there will be a role for some independent body, possibly the local government commission. But in all fairness, that would need to be significantly beefed up to deal with the complexity of what they're being asked to deal with. And particularly if we start, as I think you should be, thinking about reaching out to Southland and saying, actually, what does good look like in the bottom half? If you're thinking about the weight of our ability as a bottom half of the country to be a representative at central government level, actually being able to bring the whole of Southland Otago to the table is going to be much stronger than parts.
I can imagine, I don't know how we make it happen, a 2-day event with all councillors from Otago Southland, because I think we'd get a better, we'd know what would work and we'd end up there. But we don't know the other nuances from the other councils. So how are we ever going to work that out unless we actually meet?
Can we suggest those kind of processes to them? I mean, because obviously they don't know what's going on. Can we just put in our submission and anticipate, that there's a gap? But we could say, we do need to talk to our communities and find out where they would like to sit, potentially. And I think the councillors should be consulted, and there should be, sort of a formal process to feed through to the mayors. Doesn't necessarily mean we make a decision, but the information gathering and bringing the community along needs to be part of it.
So there is provision to engage with communities. I guess the thing is about how you make that. Potentially not just a box ticking exercise at the end of the process. But I think the implication of this is, in my mind, is that the CTB is the decision maker. Otherwise, you could end up with and I suspect they've thought about this in terms of what happened with Local Water Done Well, where, for example, the Otago councils that joined together for a water services entity, and then when it came to decision-making time, one of them opted out, and then the rest, whether that works, they have to rework that. And if you had a regional reorganisation plan based on everybody, and then one council decides not to do it, might undermine the whole proposal. So I suspect they're thinking about that in terms of the mechanism.
Still decide not to do it.
One mayor, well, no, but one
Well, no,
mayor
one
deciding
mayor's
might
not
not.
gonna- yeah, you're right. It's not
Yeah,
gonna rock
but
the
even
boat.
if one mayor votes against it.
Yeah.
To, not Brent's point.
Depending on how many votes they have.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting interplay here because that was the local government act, it was the Waitaki Council who made that decision, not the mayor just represented it, right? So similarly, we're working here in the local government act context, which has provision for reorganisation of local government anyway. I think what we're going to find is that the government are going to revert to that because it's too hard otherwise. And we'll actually have some proper processes if they take it down that route. But the other thing I was just asking Mike, while I was out of the room talking about similar things in Wellington, but that there's a bit of reorganisation of other agencies' boundaries at the moment. Fire and emergency just got rid of their regions, but they've got districts. There's an opportunity here in those conversations to better align what might be in Otago and Southland so that it fits with the Southern Health, which is Otago and Southland, with the police district, which is Otago and Southland, with fire and emergency, which is Otago and Southland. All of that stuff could work so much better if there was a meaningful level of governance at that level and though still representation.
Well, we have
Tell me
that.
what,
Sorry.
no,
If I can, yeah.
you go for it.
We have that in Zone 6, LGNZ.
Yeah.
The chair is Tama Alley, Central Otago, Clutha, Dunedin, Environment Southland, Gore, Chicago, Otago, QLDC, Southland and Waitaki. There are all of these organisations, and I guess it's sort of like, how much do you go into this sort of doing groups for group's sake versus actually...
I was going a functional approach would be better, wouldn't it?
Right.
If it works, let's do it. If
Yeah.
it doesn't, let's do something that does.
So
I was
I'm
thinking-
going to keep us on track
Oh, can I
because this yeah, we can come back to the question, but in terms of how we provide staff the direction that they're looking for
Yeah.
at this stage on the questions, because I think we're going into the regional
Yeah.
reorganisation, which is, I totally understand that, but just in terms, have we got the direction or is this?
So regarding the voting arrangements on CTVs,
Yeah, so this thing on the right-hand side of the slide here, that's something we haven't talked about yet, which is to Stephen's point about one mayor could say no, but it still comes through. How you vote, do we want to make a comment on that in terms of these different different options?
Yes.
Like, yeah, I guess one of the vulnerabilities, like you said before, is population base. Is there any other sorts of metrics that we lose out on or that could be used against us?
So Campbell could maybe explain this a bit better, but I think the effective representation or effective governance, one of those is adjusted for population using the Local Government Commission to determine that, as opposed to the one mayor, one vote, which is where the population, if you did it population based or you did it one mayor, one vote, both of those would have distorted outcomes for someone like us.
yeah, and then there's the third option, which is effective governance, which is similar to the point of the most practical decision making. And they've asked for which principles we should use to determine how the Local Government Commission balance voting powers on the CTVs. So essentially, you would give the Local Government Commission these principles. They would use each of those principles to determine how the voting power should go.
How does that sway? Can you think of an example that could help contextualise that?
So, I mean, so one mayor, one vote is obviously like rural areas would be overrepresented based on population. So if you have tens of thousands of people voting in a populated area, I guess Dunedin is our populated area, they would be represented less than if you were to have a rural vote, because that would be one. So that's obviously the imbalance there. Effective representation aims to balance that out, where you take into account population based, so the amount of people that they're represented. And then effective governance, I think, is more mysterious to me. Maybe Penny could be able to explain it better. But that's,
I thought you were going to be able to explain it.
but the principle is most effective for decision making. So I guess it's designed to break gridlocks of voting. So however the commission would go about doing that, I don't know if there's any precedent in the past. But yeah. So yeah, each of them has their pros and cons, and I guess it's hard to determine. So that's why they're asking us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talking about population, but not talking about economic power.
You could.
You could.
No,
That would be one of
at
the
the
principles
moment,
At the moment, yeah, but it's all open. They did ask for feedback.
So you could, the multiple ways of constructing, I suppose what you've got to do is make sure that they're legitimate
So
An
the,
example, I mean,
Objective, not subjective.
well, you know, when we were building, when I was many years ago building wards under the new, for the 89 one, reorganisation, we used a mixture of population, capital value and land area to try and actually create some equity across a very strong urban centre, but a very distributed but large rural sector. So there are different models which create that, but again, they've given no guidance, because what you don't want is you don't want an effective governance model that's here that's completely different to an effective governance model that might be interpreted in Northland.
well, although I think they are essentially open to saying that effective representation could have different principles for different regions, but that is...
it's so messy.
Yeah, it is
messy.
messy.
Like it's completely messy.
And I think they are asking for feedback or input into what those principles that could be used by the local government commission are, but where that gets difficult is things that would be, if we thought about things that would work for us, which might be things like economic value, economic growth, which are quite different for us than they are for other parts of Otago. But if you look at other parts of Otago that have a big rural sector, they might want totally different, they might want different principles because that's what's good for them. So you can see that in a diverse region like ours, actually even the principles themselves will be difficult to get consistency. Which is one of the things that when you get to the regional reorganisation plan might indicate where some things are logically grouped together, some areas are logically grouped versus not.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, so on that, I think that we should comment on this, and, you know, that's, I don't know what the comment is necessarily, but also I think it would be good to get clarity, not only the voting arrangements of that, but how the overall decisions will be made, because I liken it to the regional deal where actually it needs to be signed off by all the individual councils. So I do think there needs to be something more clearly stated how that will inform and how those decisions will be made, because I think, yeah, you have got that real risk if it's a decision of 5 individual people, even if I feel like that process needs to be more defined and so that
voters need to know what they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, and that they know, I don't know if I've said that very clearly. Yeah, but I think that's really important. It's not just the voting on this, but how those big decisions will be made ultimately.
It's the direction, isn't it, that's given to the people who are, if it comes down to 5 or 6 people making that decision, it's what's the direction and how that's, how your representative is mandated, because that's what it needs to be.
Yeah. It's just interesting with if the local government commission has a lot more power to define what votes land where, then is there a piece need to be done on the local government commission? Is that fit for purpose in that context if it has that much power? Because I feel this is all about water. And I feel we're sitting around a table, this is the point I was going to make before, talking about how we divide up regions, but we're not tuned into water, we're a district council. So catchment basis is how it's been, and that's why regional councils were set up as they were. Now we're chopping the governance of regional councils and leaving it to people who have had no past interest or no experience in that to redefine everything. And I just don't know how that works out, because I feel like that's where we're going. So if we're going down the one that seems to make the most, it's not democratic, but maybe it could be by the local government commission and going, what's effective governance? It sounds good. There's got to be some clarity around that before we vote. I think we'll pitch to that option, and I do think we need to understand how do we vote in the local government commission? How do we?
Because you would argue that, let's say it's the end of this triennium and everything's been changed and there's new responsibilities and new organisations, that what the population might want in their elected representatives might be very different from what we've got now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It might be.
We probably do need to tie up
your time
sessions. You guys get a bit of break. Is there any?
There was one other thing that we actually haven't talked about, But I think we are at the end of the time. I just want to flag it in case anybody has some comments they want to make, if they can send them to us. So if you just go back a slide, the principles to drive I think it sounds like we're all supportive of doing a regional reorganisation plan. So what's important is the governance over it, which we've talked about. And these are the principles that they're proposing that would the criteria that the local government, because the local government commission assesses the regional reorganisation planning essentially against these criteria. So the regional reorganisation is done with these outcomes. Well, they're not really outcomes.
Where's the environment in this?
With these in mind.
Is it? Do you feel like the environment's captured? Do you feel like healthy water fits in there anywhere? I
feel like the environment is captured within the legislative frameworks that surround the things that we deliver. These are specifically focused on the
democracy and
on the role of local government in a more generic, but in a more system sense.
Well, that's right, and there is, I think, this is what I picked up in some of the conversations, is that there's an anticipation that much of the environmental protection role of regional councils would be picked up by a national environment agency, like
that
the
seems to be the
UK.
implication.
Yeah, which doesn't work particularly well, nor does it in other countries that I've been to and or worked in. So it's something we need to keep in mind. But, you know, if we're looking at this, then there's sort of questions that some of us have been talking about for a while. You know, what would that look like on the ground? What would that actually look like on the ground? So it's reorganised. It would probably be, if Auckland's anything like it, there'd be a local board for Upper Clutha, there'd be a local board for Wakatipu, there'd be a local board for Cromwell, and there'd be one, if maybe for Maniatoto and Alexandra, within the unitary authority, and there might be Northern South, I don't know. So that's the model for ensuring that there's still local say, but it's pretty watered down, different sort of water. But so, you know, we have to understand that that's where this is intended to go. So how do we get the most out of that, or push back against it and say, well, that's actually not going to deliver for our communities, and I think the economy is the one to focus on, because that's what the government, I think, is most interested in, and enabling farmers to be able to do things without as much regulation.
So I guess the key thing for a submission is whether these criteria will give the CTB the best framing to come up with a model that gets the best outcomes. So we're not talking about the actual reorganisation at this stage. These are the criteria that are going to be used to assess our plan. But we're about out of time, so
support national priorities is quite strong.
Yeah, I have a problem with that.
But how does it balance with local say? I didn't. Yeah. Plus, there's also some stuff around work better, cost less. So there's stuff around finances, but I still think somewhere in there, within the subtext, the environment matters.
Yeah.
And I think it should be in one of those boxes, and it's not. We've got financials, we've got, you know,
Treaty.
I think environment should be mentioned in both the big picture fit and the local say, I think.
Or is its own box?
Yeah, even better services, what does better look like? But I know what you're saying, but
anyway, I think Penny asked for it to be emailed through.
Yeah, good point.
Sorry. We do have lots of topics to get through today, so just to make sure we've got time for each of them. If anyone has any specific thoughts on the criteria in terms of things are missing, as you've just highlighted some things you think are too strong, then if you can just email them through, that would be great. Tomorrow, preferably.
Play today.
Yeah.
Well, not today, because you're going to be here with us all day.
If we're going to keep on track, should we just go for a 5-minute leg stretch, quick comfort stop, and then back in 5?
That's
okay. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Those that may have not met me before, my name's Alison Hutton. I'm the Manager of Planning Policy here at QLDC. Up at the table with me, I have Honor, who's the Principal Planner in the Policy team, and we'll have Brian in a minute, who's the Principal Planner in the Resource Consents team, and the lovely Anita in terms of spatial planning. Today we've got a presentation and we'll take you through the planning and environment bills. Given the discussion that I've just sat through before, it might be that we do our best to whip through the presentation slide by slide so that you've got that overview, and then we'll come back to questions, and then at that stage say go back to PowerPoint, the slide that addressed X, so it's back in front of us to help us with discussion, because we do want to make use of the time that we've got in front of us. Yes, it should be. Is it on this side? No, that's, yep, very good. Cool. So without further ado, I will hand over to Honor to take over, and yeah, thank you very much.
Good morning, councillors. My name is Honor and I work with Ali, and yeah, really good to be here. And I'm just going to cut to the chase. So, how will we navigate today's discussion? To make sense of these reforms and their impact on QLDC, I will take you through 5 key steps today. So the story will be, we will be recapping the new framework, and I'll provide you a quick overview of the framework, replacing the Resource Management Act, and explain what has changed. And then I will explain why these changes were proposed and share the government's intent behind reform in their own words, so the government's rationale. And then I will walk you through 4 fundamental topics proposed by the government and outline the strategic and operational challenges that this basically presents to QLDC. So that's the key topics and challenges. And then I will categorise these points for you, which present these topics grouped as opposing, supporting or clarification. And then I will get your thoughts on these matters and as potential submission points and or clarification points for a letter to the Minister. All right. So, the replacement bills represent a major transformation for Aotearoa's planning and resource management system. It's a completely new system. Government aims to unlock the growth, reduce infrastructure costs, protect the environment, improve resilience to natural hazards. And at the same time, they'd like to free up property rights and make rules simpler. Ministers call it a game changer and a once-in-a-generation shift towards growth, choice and possibility. At its core, the new system is designed to make things easier so that things get done while protecting what really matters. So, as part of the regulatory impact assessments that has been done for these bills, which our team looked at, the government commissioned Castalia, a sort of a company, to assess the costs of the current RMA system and the proposed reforms. And the analysis found that there will be an estimated benefit of $14.5 billion to New Zealand. And the key driver was a projected 45% reduction in administrative and compliance costs. The Castalia's assessment focused on environmental outcomes, infrastructure delivery, housing and urban development, and broader economic productivity. All right, so the cabinet paper that kicked off the 3rd phase of the reform, the replacement bills, boils down hundreds of pages into 10 core principles. So these principles come from the cabinet paper. So think of these principles as the essence of the planning and natural environment bills. So this is a clear snapshot of what government is wanting to do for the 300 pages of each bills. So first one is to narrow the scope of the effects and controls, establish 2 acts with clear and distinct purposes, putting environmental limits and how they're to be developed, use of national standards to reduce the need for consents, shift the system focus to compliance, monitoring and enforcement, use spatial planning to lower the cost of future infrastructure, requiring 1 regulatory plan per region jointly prepared, rapid low-cost resolution of disputes between neighbours and between property owners and councils, uphold Treaty of Waitangi settlements and the Crown's obligations, and provide faster, cheaper, less litigious processes within shorter, less complex and more accessible legislation. So just want to note something before I get into the slide. So we've looked into the RISs and the cabinet paper, and for both bills showed that extensive technical work. Okay, so that the government officials did quite a lot of work so to reach at this stage, and almost every topic is backed by really strong arguments and evidence. and leaving little room for challenge beyond political or philosophical perspectives, if you like. So just wanting to note that. So from a technical perspective, the bills introduce some potential positives. A more certain system, clear processes, and very few grey areas. So, however, note that this certainty comes with a sort of strong, it comes with an assumption where that relies on strong national direction and guidance. Without top-tier national frameworks, the system's assumptions may not hold. So it's really important. So let's talk about these key positives of the proposed system. And councillors, the council may want to support these aspects in our potential submission. So just while I'm talking, perhaps consider these as something to do also QLDC could support. So the first one is the standardised zones and provisions. So a consistent framework, for instance, no special treatment for individual areas that we've got quite a lot currently in our district. Compulsory spatial planning and binding environmental limits. Mandatory spatial plans to align infrastructure and land use, avoiding costly misalignment, and then binding environmental limits to ensure quantitative thresholds to prevent further environmental degradation. Resolving land use disputes through the funnel. I think you will remember the funnel from the previous briefing that you had, but if you didn't, we can talk about that later. So the government introduced this funnel idea where everything will be resolved at the top and will be directive, and it will go funnel through to the bottom, where fewer matters open for debate, reducing delays and limiting NIMBY-style objections. And moves away from costly processes like Schedule 1 in the RMA, where anyone can submit if they're not even directly related or affected to a problem. Focused dispute resolution, a narrow effects-based framework to reduce court battles over subjective issues. For instance, preserving derelict heritage at the expense of health and safety won't be a thing anymore in this new system. And again, just reiterating, you may want to support these aspects of the proposed system as they could save QLDC significant costs and reduce litigation and streamline our processes. All right, so
So I'm just questioning, how are we going to have meaningful feedback on this when we're going through the whole? I just find it hard to go back to, do you know what I mean? How do we have discussions on, is there a chance?
So what I was thinking was we can turn it around though to complete the presentation, and then we can have discussion, or we can go through every single one of them, which could be quite long, but that's okay.
It's just losing the moment when you're talking about something. Sometimes it's hard to go back. You might miss our, you know, do we want to support some of those positives? Is that something that you want some feedback on now?
Let's go back to that slide then, and if we get an indication from those in the room as to the importance or not of those issues.
Yeah, just what we wanted to try and avoid was something we were going to cover. So perhaps if you want to ask questions as you go, if there's something we're going to be discussing in a few slides' time, we'll just let you know that and come back to it at that slide. Does that make sense?
Okay, so my question might be, if we're talking about standardised zones, is what that involves. Are they imposed on us? Do we have to consult on it? Are they arguable through the court the same way as ours? So that's the sort of thing I would like to know a little bit about before we say yes. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'll leave it to you to make best use of the time on those.
Yeah, I think the good news on the way, and we'll see how we're progressing.
Okay.
So, yeah.
We can give you a little quick snapshot in terms of how standardised zones work, in case you haven't done that reading.
At a high level, I'd just say the comment that I just heard was that these would be positive for us because they would cost us less. But we're representing our community, and it's what allows the community the opportunity to have a say as well. So they're the ones that we're working for, they're the ones we're representing to help shape this place. So yes, there are positives in that it might cost less, there's more certainty, there's disputes. At the same time, there's less opportunity for our community to have a say. If we went ahead and supported that, I think that's problematic.
I understand what you're saying, Councillor. There's two, I guess, points. We've got the use of standardised zones and provisions. So those zones, like residential, industrial, they will be given to us. We won't have the same full-on submission process that we go through when we're creating a district plan, but we do still have the opportunity to do bespoke provisions for our district, but we have quite a lot of additional layers to be able to use those. In terms of the justification that council does, which is like a section 32 but a bit different, it's called a justification report to be able to create layers of change like an out of town specialised zone or something like that. And then when we're using those bespoke provisions, that's when it would open up the opportunities for us, or not, I wouldn't say necessarily opportunities, but in terms of the process where we're changing what people can do, and if that's going to come to a cost to council in terms of, what's the word of it, special word that's just gone out of my head. No, not the funnel, in terms of the regulatory relief, because we're imposing something that is more than a normal residential zone and stuff.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So how would that even work?
So can I just ask?
Just respond to the nub of your question, Councillor.
Yeah.
So we weren't intending to submit on potential positives. We want to try and set the scene in terms of the fact that there are some potentials here that are beneficial. There are also the flip side of those, and we'll go through the different changes and overall in the presentation pinpoint some parts that we've seen that might be really worth concentrating on in a submission. But to say potential positives, we're certainly not saying that that's something QLDC is shouting at the hilltop.
Okay, because we've got the impression that we might like to support them, and I just think there's an issue there if we haven't fully thought through and seen the implications of some of this. And at a high level, I'd just like to think that when we're making this submission, that we're making the submission with the people that we represent in mind, not just with the organisation in mind, if that makes sense.
No, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not saying you weren't, it's just I wasn't getting that flavour.
And I guess to basically a bit more, and also the answer to your question, Mayor, is that so national standards are going to be set by the national direction, right at the top, national policy direction. So they'll be released, and then after that, national standardised zoning will be also set. So this will make, from a technical, purely planning perspective, as a planner, wearing the planner hat, that is really useful because there'll be kind of like more straightforward definitions of zones, and that will not take our land use plan bespoke provisions, just to assure you that, because that's not about, we will still have a land use plan in QLDC, we will still have our bespoke provisions. It's just those main zones from a technical perspective will be set by the national direction. So that doesn't necessarily take away our way of saying, hey, we can still have these bespoke provisions.
I think just before we just move on though, it's important just to recognise that the overall thesis of the government is to make the cost of planning cheaper, to make it less available to people to participate in. And while Honor has said, yes, it's more cost effective for us, arguably that's also the government's analysis, that actually it should be cost effective to ratepayers. And that comes with the overall direction, which is a reduction of the opportunity for complexity and the opportunity for involvement. So I suppose all of community are trying to recognise, because there will be some people for whom standardised zones are very attractive. There'll be developers for whom knowing that the same zone applies in Queenstown, Wanaka, Alexandra, Dunedin, again, very attractive. And I think, as Ali said, there are still provisions to bespoke them, but the threshold cost to communities to get there is quite high. And if you then step into the regulatory relief provisions, then there is a big, and argue in the government's mind, a very transparent cost to us as a community saying, we want to protect this value, so therefore you're compensating people for that. So I think, again, go back to what is the philosophy that the government and the legislation is driving and how we work inside that.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Do we need to work inside it, or do we need to put forward our actual view? I mean, this is not law yet, and we're making law. So do we go, well, the government, this is the government's framework, this is what it's aiming for. Can we not push back sometimes on what it's aiming for? Or do we always feel like we have to submit within the direction of the government? Because I don't know that that's necessarily representing our people best. It's just a high level question, but I do feel like we are working within what the government wants a lot of the time. I'd like to see us being a bit bold for our communities on some things.
Well, I think the question of that is though,
Yeah.
and I don't disagree, but you know, what is the community that you're dealing with? Because actually the community, I think it needs to be writ large.
Yeah.
There is a very diverse community in all our communities. And so, you know, and then one of the things, you know, like any of the planners will tell you, when we get, you know, 20 or 30 different unique residential zones just to meet the aspirations of one individual developer or one individual landowner, that's not good for the community as a whole. And I suppose at its root, the standardised zones, I mean, they did quote the Japanese model, which has 10 zones across the country. Well, that economy doesn't seem to be, well, actually, I was going to say it's not easily failing, but it's not doing particularly well either. But, you know, I mean, I think that's the balance to be struck. How do you respond as a council to, you know, some of the overriding drivers, which are clearly the government's drivers around efficiency and reduction, versus how do you ensure that there is enough for communities to feel that they have a say in their future?
Yeah.
I'll also give you an example to actually, Mike just reminded me. So for some of this, I'll give you a really kind of clear technical example how actually is usable that to standardise zones. So we've got Jack's Point zone, Mount Cardrona zone, Kingston Special Zone. So these all have for residential components, rural components, all are going to be all streamlined. They're not going to be called Jack Point zone because they all already have those specific technical planning zones within them already. So it's going to make it a lot easier for people to read and also like explain, go through, make it less administratively, daunting and a bit more friendly. So that's, for instance, a really cool example that how it will change the things.
So Cody was waiting. Nikki and then John.
I get the principle of that. Will they just put developers, push them towards covenants, and will they just replace special zones with more covenants? And is there anything in the RMA around covenants?
Not as related to that. The bill doesn't really speak to that, but we can take away that as a question and see what the bill is kind of saying in that, but not likely from what it's proposed.
No, there's nothing that I'm aware of that addresses covenants, and that's something that's in the RMA system as well. In some residential zones, we've got 2 tiers of rules, essentially what is required under the district plan and a covenant as well, and that's,
Because that seems like the most prohibitive sort of zoning rule anyway, like most of the time on restrictions. I mean, Jake's Point can still be Jake's Point by a covenant, it doesn't have to really be a special zone.
And that's something that we've previously highlighted to the government as well, because that also is one of, in a recent, I'm not trying to talk too much, but districts like Queenstown, where we've got lots of recent subdivisions, they all have covenants. Many of those have no further subdivision, 1 dwelling per unit. So that's really restricting the densification that we could be trying to achieve. We might request it or provide for it under a district plan, but if it's not going to be realised, then it's a little bit of a moot point.
Yeah.
So it's a bit an outline and QLDC.
People bought those properties knowing that there was a covenant here they couldn't subdivide, so this seems to be a lot about...
Over time that does change, but yes, yeah.
This seems to be more designed that if you own your land and it doesn't have restrictions, then you really should be able to do whatever you want within some reasons.
Yeah.
Sorry, sorry, John.
That's right. I think Nikki wanted to make a point, and then John wanted
Just
to
a
make
quick
point.
caution around being thrilled about, environmental groups potentially not being able to have a say. I think, often when something happens to a landowner that may be directly affected, they don't have the ability or the finances to take something forward. Environmental groups have played a really important role. And
I just think we've said that. I'd be really sad if...
I just thought maybe we can put it in the pushback bit that actually there is a role for groups, because I do struggle. Otherwise, we land in this position where the people with the money have control over the outcome.
As I understand it, the legislation, you can submit on these processes as long as you live within the district that you're submitting on. So I haven't seen anything that restricts groups of people working together and stuff. And for us, in terms of eliminating of lengthy local plan making and stuff. It's actually great when groups of like-minded people work together. It really streamlines hearings processes and the works. Yeah.
John.
So, just to basically, so the people will be able to feedback, submit at the top level documents that are coming from the national governments, that they're able to do whatever they say and whatever they want to submit.
Maybe if your next slide is the funnel one. Okay. Because
Just before we move on, I think John was wanting to raise a point.
So on that, thanks, John. That point that both Cody and then Stephen segued into, and Nick kind of talked to as well, this whole role of covenants, I think it would be useful if we could get a collective view to suggest, and I'm happy to have that conversation, that a lot of the rhetoric in this discussion that's been going on with the current government in particular, and previously in campaigns, etc., is that it's the local, that is the RMA and district plans, maybe regional policy statements, that are the problem. But and they talk about 1,100 different rules in district plans. It's simply not true. You look at the district plans, having built houses in 4 local authorities now in the last little while, the rules are all pretty much the same, largely. Yes, they're stated slightly differently, but so that's not entirely true. But the biggest problem is usually, and deliberately so, covenants to constrain development, which is intended to maintain property values into the future. So if the philosophy of this legislation is to better enable things to be streamlined, enable development in maybe the right places, but in a way that respects private property rights, once someone buys a property, they shouldn't be encumbered by those things if it doesn't affect their neighbours. So there's a contradiction in the proposed legislation at the moment that is not helpful for our communities, I think. Just getting back to, I'm happy if you want to respond to that, but then, having, and as I said the last time we talked about this is, I think, flashbacks to like the Town and Country Planning Act, where there was similarly a suite of zones that you could choose from, and you had no other options other than special zones, and it's the same here. So you can do that. So you choose from those, but where local influence comes in is where those zones are. What applies to what? What does that mean here? So there is actually room, but it's a much narrower than the current setup. So it still happens, but it'll be different.
Yeah, agreed.
Are you able to explain or anticipate? So we'll get these zones, we don't know what they are yet. So what would the process be? So we get our 12 jigsaw pieces. We've got a district or a region. How do we and who works out what goes where, and how contestable is that?
Okay, spatial planning is going to be really important, and this respect in terms of setting the scene for urban zones, rural zones, zones that need space, such as industrial zones. So that part of plan making is really up the top now, which is really cool. We'll have that statutory weight. Anita can add to that, but we don't have to be that specific within that spatial planning ambit. It's urban, rural, industrial, whatever. And then at the plan making stage, it will be choosing the bespoke zones and the justification for why those zones in those areas. People can submit on that zone, like I wanted residential 3 instead of residential 1, but they can't submit on the specificity of that zone in terms of what the objectives, policies and rules say. So it's really streamlined.
Who has the final decision on the zone for that area? Is it us or is it the court? That's John's question. Because we know this town is very litigious.
We've got a year. We have to do this within a year.
Yeah, it's going to be really fast.
So what the bill basically tells us is that there will be a national policy direction, and in that national policy direction will basically release a whole bunch of national policy documents for planning, and they're going to be really specific. This is all of the assumptions that the governments are making, by the way. And then they will release a national standards zoning. So basically the regional combined plans in the bill are supposed to give effect to those provisions. And at that level, the national level instruments, people are allowed and enabled to submit and give feedback and push back and argue those things. And then when it comes through the regional combined planning, spatial planning, and the land use planning stage, people will be able to less argue about those specific things. So that's how the whole system is set up. So it will be the central government officials defining those things at the top, and then people can argue at that level whether something is appropriate or not. And then it kind of funnels through the bottom to our land use plan, which can still have these folk rules, but as Ellie mentioned, it will need to have a justification report why we are suggesting something special for our district, and which leads to the regulatory relief framework, because if something is different and not enabling A or B for someone, then they can ask for relief from the council. So that's kind of the setup of the whole system.
And are we expecting there will be a zone that covers outstanding natural landscape?
Yes. So that's ONFLs is an overlay that are protected and under the goals of the planning bill. So there will be 4 things. So that would be the historic heritage. ONFLs are outstanding natural areas and features, landscapes, and sites and areas significant to Māori and hazards. These places will be quite similar to RMA. They will still be having an overlay and as treated as sort of the Section 6 matters, national importance matters in the RMA. So it's quite similar.
But the regulatory relief wouldn't apply to a hazard zone. It wouldn't make sense. Would it?
Oh, no.
So they're all. Yeah.
No, I will talk about that actually.
Okay, sorry.
No, regulatory relief doesn't, but it's got other problems actually, but we'll talk about that later.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so those were some of the positives as sort of laid out, as Dave mentioned. They're not necessarily, like you might want to support, but think about that as positives. So I just wanted to also take you through, so these planning bill, 300 something odd pages, and same with the natural environment bill. So just wanting to give you a flavour of like some of the key changes. Just we'll go through that. Okay, so you will have seen in the briefing note, there's actually more to these bills than initially apparent. The first one that I really would like to talk to is and we're going to come back to this one because it's quite tricky for our operations, the effects framework. So that is outlined in section 14, and hopefully you would have a bit of a maybe nosy if you had a chance in the planning bill. So this section narrows the effects down significantly and introduces some out of scope effects. So basically what that means is somebody comes for a resource consent, our consent planner would only be able to assess certain effects, not all of the effects. So it narrows down so that it could enable the developer or whoever wants to do something on their land. So the effects framework in the new system represents a deliberate move away from the broad, all-encompassing approach of the RMA toward a more targeted and proportionate funnel architecture, as we mentioned. So while the RMA required decision makers to consider almost any potential impact, regardless of scale, the new framework narrows the scope of regulated effects to reduce the number of consents and simplify the system. So basically, consent plans will be able to kind of say, okay, I'm not assessing that, so move on. So it's basically the purpose is to enable more. So that's effects framework. We'll get back to that in a second. The second one is the goals of the planning bill, which is outlined in section 11. So in the Resource Management Act, we had this section 5, sustainable management of resources, and it basically included the natural environment and the built environment. So it's your building structures, but as well as your rivers, mountains, things, and air and all of that. Whereas because the bills are split now, you've got only the land and use development in the planning bill, and then the natural environment in the natural and environment bill. So it's completely separated. So there will be no hierarchy between these two goals. The policy intention is that there's no inherent hierarchy among these goals and they're considered equal in importance. Now, there's a bit of an issue on that one. So these goals will be particularized through the national policy direction that I mentioned. So they're going to be outlined in the national direction, and then which provides then specific instructions on how they must be achieved. So no re-litigation of these goals. We can't re-litigate them. And then crucially, these goals cannot be really re-litigated at the lower levels, which people can do right now under the RMA. They can go like, oh, there's an impact. Whereas with this system, that's completely ruled out in the lower levels of the system, such as during individual consent hearings, once they've been settled in the higher order plans. So this is an important one because a planning bill only focuses on enabling development and land use. Natural and Environment Bill manages environmental limits and protections of air, water, soils, and biodiversity. While this is intended to provide clarity to people, like you can go to the planning bill for this, this got serious practical implementation issues because you will have, for instance, managing earthworks sediment in an urban form, or you've got all sorts of interesting issues where we are at the moment thinking about an integrated way because we've got one act, whereas these separate acts are just dealing with their own domain, if you like. Natural environment is in the natural environment, the buildings and things are in the planning bill. So, so this one is a really interesting one. Third one is the permitted baseline threshold, removal of less than minor effects. One of the most significant changes in the bill is the raising of the materiality bar for what the system considers relevant. So it discards the minor effects. So the activities with the less than minor effects are not going to be considered by decision makers unless those effects contribute to a larger cumulative impact. And
who argues less than minor?
Sorry?
Who argues what's less than minor? In this framework direction. No, well, in an individual application, if it goes in, and obviously less people can dispute, and you can't dispute based on the higher goals, you're going to have, crappy. Sorry,
it would be the same as our current system, and it's between less than minor, more than minor.
But there's less room for debating.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they're removing that wording as well because this is a wording in the RMA: less than minor, more than major, more than minor.
And there's more importance probably on the way individual planners and stuff interpret the plans. Like if there is a lack of clarity in the plan, the discretion of the planners, the people working in that space, the limited people working in that space with limited opportunities for appeals is going to be really important.
Yes, because of the outcome of that funnel system, and by the time that you do get down to a consenting process, there is less opportunity.
So that's going to be a really important part of the BAL process, isn't it? Sorry, we're not talking about that.
No, that's good. That's good. That is creating some questions. Basically, this is defined as an effect that is acceptable and reasonable in a receiving environment where any change is slight or barely noticeable, so it will be all gone. And affected person status, to be considered an affected person with the right to participate in a consent or permit process, the adverse effect on that person must now be more than minor. So it can't be just, any person who's who can kind of contribute to that process.
Yeah.
The other one is we talked about a funnel decision making. The funnel approach makes the system more directive, as we talked about, more directive from the top, ensuring consistency across the country and allowing local communities to focus on applying that approach in their area. It would make decision making more focused at each stage of the planning system, as I kind of mentioned before. And so by all means, it doesn't remove the locality or, our bespoke systems. As the process narrows, fewer things would be up for debate and saving time and money. It would also give people greater certainty about what they can and can't do, helping them understand likely outcomes before they even begin and before they invest into those processes. The fifth one is a really interesting one. So the section 92, part 3, schedule 4, I think, from schedule 4, part 3, from memory. So, and this introduces compensation mechanisms, and this is a serious difference from the RMA. RMA rarely compensated anybody for anything. So this is a major The framework is built on the enjoyment of private property rights as a guiding principle, which is in the purpose of the bill. It actually spells it out, enjoyment of land in the purpose of the bill. So this basically works towards that. There's a presumption of right. So landowners have a presumption that they can use their land unless it produces negative externalities that exceed the new materiality thresholds. And then if a council wants to create a local rule that is more restrictive than national standards at the top, it must produce a justification report assessing the costs, benefits, and impact on the reasonable use of land, and then introduce a regulatory framework, relief framework, where they're going to say basically, there will be people who will be arguing with that. So here's my framework to address those objections. So, which we'll get into that later again.
Just on point number 5.
Sure.
So effectively, you could make the case that council has to compensate people who might, through inheritance or through tenure review, might have inherited O&Ls and O&Fs, and now they have to be compensated for those to maintain those O&Ls and O&Fs. Otherwise, they can do whatever they want. Is that correct?
That is, yeah, roughly close to what they're proposing. But obviously, there are some criteria, and that needs to go through to assessment, because it needs to have a significant impact of reasonable use of land. So obviously the onus on them as well, like whether they're saying, oh, I've got a significant, so with the council's overlay of ONFL, you're inhibiting my use of land and you're having a significant impact on my reasonable use of land, which is, by the way, very subjective. So
somebody who might have inherited a ridgeline and a whole mountainside through tenure review would then have to be compensated to maintain it in that state.
If I could just, sorry, Ellie. So just, we're going to, this is a really juicy issue that we need to actually get into in more detail shortly through this presentation. I'm really conscious of time in terms of getting through this information, which you would have read, and you would have read the briefing documents. So I think we'll probably take these as read, go through them very quickly, but then get onto those really substantive issues like the one you're raising, and describe and discuss a bit more in detail about what's actually happening under something as far as regulatory relief, because it's a major concern for us.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is just to think about it. We don't know what these zones are going to look like yet. We don't know what the government's spatial overlay of ONFs and ONLs will look like. At the moment, you can still farm in ONFs and ONLs within our district plan. If you buy rural land for rural purposes, we don't have many, or if any, too many anyway, encumbrances, in terms of prohibiting or putting too many barriers for people using rural land for rural purposes. So we need to think in the realm of that, which is really hard because we don't actually know what these zones look like and what the provisions that will be enabled or disabled look like.
Yeah, correct. So the underlying zone is really important because ONFLs are an overlay, and that's something that we must protect. But as Ellie mentioned, if the underlying zone is urban or something like outer res or something, then yes, the answer to that question would be yes, because it's expected that to be a outer residential zone and it's sitting on an ONFL, so the person is expecting that use to happen. Whereas if it is rural, you can only do certain activities on rural and there are not many things permitted on that anyway, so that will kind of automatically remove the problems. But if the national direction says, hey, the government is wanting to remove all of the rural and urban growth boundary, we want to make more rural space urban, then you will definitely have an issue. Because
spatial planning. All right, carry on.
That's right. So the last one on this page is the activity status. So the government basically removed, you might know this from the previous RMA, the current RMA, that we've got a permitted, controlled, restricted, discretionary, non-compliant and prohibited activities. And government is removing controlled and non-compliant by basically contributing to their cost-saving system. So that's another one. I'll move on to the next one. So we've got also a new planning tribunal introduced. So this introduces an improved dispute mechanism. basically aiming less environment court processes and expanding the powers and roles. This may affect council's decision-making autonomy, obviously, in appeal processes because it's introducing the planning tribunal to look after those kind of litigation issues. Notification requirements restricts the use of public notification and introduces a targeted notification, moving away from RMA's broad participatory approach, as I mentioned before. So only certain peoples can actually kind of go into the process with this notification system. Ministerial powers significantly increased, while the RMA was a largely devolved system where you had the national policy direction, regional policy statements, regional council and district plans. So where the decision-making sat with local councils, this basically makes minister a bit more like in charge. And basically, they're significantly increased. The central government's intent to take a broader and more active role in shaping and overseeing the planning and environmental regimes. The next one is the new designation process. This is a really interesting one, and I think we'll get down to that. You might have also read it in the briefing note that introduces a new designation process where the minister kind of is, again, a bit more in charge and moves away from RMA's ad hoc approach. This is something that will impact our designations because we've got heaps in our district plan, and it basically channels the designation through to infrastructure and makes it very clear what can be a designation, what can be a designation. It basically aims to improve designation process by enabling early identification and protection of infrastructure needs, especially through spatial planning again. Another one is some financial improvements. You'll see in the bill, retains the power to charge, for councils to charge for their activities for recouping that, but now explicitly empowered to fix charges. So you can fix charges and then basically recoup that by being really clear. All right.
When you say fixed charges, you mean having a fixed charge?
Yeah, that's right. So it's basically in the RMA, you can do a couple of different options, but the bill is actually kind of wanting to make the councils more fixing charges over what they're doing and then making that really clear to people.
Gotcha.
Which will also help us, our operations. Yeah. So, okay. So I need to speak to this. Yeah.
So in terms of regional spatial planning, I think at a high level the changes are quite positive. There's a really big push to integrate all our planning, have a high level of integration with our infrastructure planning, but also our regional and long-term plans. But what that means is a spatial plan becomes a highly critical document, and it's really important that we get it right from the start, particularly with the critical links with the water CCO and giving that direction as we want them to be the plan taker. So I think those types of things are quite positive, but 4 key areas I'd like to discuss today is in our submission, should we be thinking about regional versus sub-regional? I just wanted to highlight just a couple of timing and process issues that we might want to be aware of, just thinking about our community and the input, and the role of the Grow Alpha Oral partnership and how we talk about that at the submission, and just how if we would like to also submit something similar to what we did with the fast track bill on value capture for affordable housing. So the regional versus sub-regional, it is linked to simplifying the local government, and if you look at the government's their preferred approach is that the CTB would take over. So while it's in the bill right now that you'd have a spatial planning committee, we could be looking in a future where it could be the CTB, the mayors. So that's something,
I think they should determine the scale.
Yeah.
Because that makes sense. I mean, however we put the regional the representation plan, that should drive the scale, shouldn't it? But you shouldn't have 4 mayors determining the spatial plan.
No. So that's something. So another thing is, so the CTB, they appear to have the ability, or at the moment the predetermination to determine sub-regional or regional. But the problem that we have is that we will have to do a regional or a spatial plan before the CTB is set up. So we may have a layer where we have a CTB, a spatial planning committee. So those are things. So it is, it'll be quite good for councils like us. Is our preferred approach is that we would like a sub-regional. We would move towards more of a sub-regional, or are we still open to doing something
That's what I was going to ask, because I was like, Central Otago is different to Otago,
Yeah.
sub-regional, that's the obvious
Yeah,
sort of
so it'll be
nuance.
more inland, so sort of really in line with what we're doing with our regional deal right now. So you have the Inland Council, which is us in Central Otago, and then you've got the coastal, which is Waitaki, Clutha, Dunedin. I mean, eventually you can imagine a world where I suppose even if we did have 2 sub-regional plans, there would be an overarching regional plan. But that's just something to think about in our submission. Is that something we want to highlight at this stage to be more in line with what we've been doing regional deal, or we're okay still sitting under that regional envelope?
It's just a case of how would you make decisions, because we've got the decision-making structure set up here. If you want to go beyond that to regional, then what does that look like? Do we have a subcommittee? Do less people make the decisions? What does it mean for local people who have asked for all of us and are expecting all of us to be representing them in these decisions? Then maybe there might be 3 from this council. So it's all tied into that stuff, and it might create more work. It might be easier before in the interim carry on as we are, and then once we know the structure.
I think sub-regional for sure. I think there's a lot of continuity with Central Otago in terms of like sports and waste and other things. And I think in general, if we're going to fight for something, we should fight for Central Otago being vastly different to the rest of Otago. I think that just makes the most sense for a lot of ways.
But there will be some topics that are broader than sub-regional. If you're looking at transport corridors, if you're looking at education, tertiary education, health and all of those other things for land use planning, I guess some of them are broader. I mean, they're going to be pretty very high level. But
to contest that, as we've seen, we have problems having regionalised health plans because we're all, hours away from a hospital. So I think we should fight for sub-region.
Right, we just need to get that decision-making structure right.
Yeah, I think in general, Central Otago needs to build a really strong brand for New Zealand because we are this.
It's a better name, you're right.
If we consider this in relation to the legislation side of the submission we're making, I think it would be more of a suggestion of saying we need some ability to have something bespoke of these provisions of creating a regional plan to allow us and allow government to recognise that we're in a slightly different position than other places in the country.
Whether there's section, the Chatham Islands have that special provision already, so there is the ability to do that within there.
So unless, if that's what the council would like us to do, that would be the proposal, is to just try and get flexibility so that we're not doing things that don't make sense for this council in relation to regional and a sub-regional.
I'm just thinking though, looking back to the conversation we had earlier, actually the submission in relation to the simplification might be a place to put that comment, because that's where the proposal is that the CTB is the decision maker. So this legislation doesn't say that because the legislation for the CTB hasn't been put in yet. So we have interpreted the government's
sorry, we can hear you.
So we assume that that's because the RMA ledge has come before the simplifying local government ledge, and this was already in train. So the implication is that when the legislation comes into simplifying local government, it will change what's in the RMA, because the proposal that they're asking for feedback on in simplifying local government is that the CTB is the decision maker for the spatial plan chapter and the natural environment.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably in that proposal where we might want to comment on it.
Because again, we come down to what's our region. Is it Otago? Is it northern south? And economically, the linkages between here and Tianau are very different from where they are between here and Dunedin, as are our transport needs. So.
And look, I think it's important in terms of the breadth of this legislation and the time we've had. A lot of the submission points, if they're agreed today, will be about clarifications on what you mean. Because here's our situation. And it's kind of to say, this doesn't make sense for us. And we know it's been done really quickly, but these are the concerns we have.
Especially with the voting being so up in the air and how that would work. If you've got the CTB,
there's a different voting mechanism for the CTB for these specific decisions, a totally separate mechanism than what we talked about earlier for general CTB decisions. And we didn't specifically talk about that earlier, but it's a specified decision making.
Got it, John?
Yeah.
You're all over it.
I've just entered my diary for the next year.
And when do you get to renegotiate your salary? You mentioned, Ali, value capture for housing.
Oh, yeah, and
I was looking down when I heard it. So we're covering that later?
Oh, no, I was going to cover, I thought I'd just go through the process and then I'll talk about that just last, about how we deal with it.
Thank you.
The only other thing to talk about, well, there's a couple other, the process. So essentially we have to notify the regional, sub-regional plan within 15 months of the act coming through, and that is actually 6 months after we receive national direction. So that is a really tight time frame. Just to put in perspective, it took us 3.5 years to do our original spatial plan. So while we're not coming from, we're coming from a source of lots of knowledge. If we do have to work regionally, Clutha and, there are other councils that are coming from different areas, and I know the Act enables you to use the best possible information, but 15 months is really tight considering how important of a document it is. On top of that, when we notify it, it only gives our community 20 working days to provide comments on it. So I think there are some process things that, thinking of our community, it would be good for us just to raise and say, hey, this is implications. What it also highlights is in that 15 months, we're going to have to do a significant amount of engagement with our community to make sure we get it right, particularly in that designation space too, which I'll leave to Honor and Ali to talk about later, but designations can be placed in our spatial plan and making sure that our community really understand what that means, because it is quite a different process. So another thing in terms of timings is the spatial plan needs to give effect to environmental limits. Now this first spatial plan, we won't have the environmental limits, so we just need to highlight that this first spatial plan there may need to be re-looked at once we get our land use plans. So they're sort of looking at each other. So there are some timings and process issues that I think it would be worthwhile highlighting, in particular for our community, because it is just the importance of now what the spatial plan means and the ability for it to change. So with the review, they're saying you can re-look at your spatial plan every 10 years or when the spatial plan committee think it's appropriate to do so. So we could be looking at having a spatial plan for 10 years, I think, in our area, which is very unlikely because we will be looking at it. But still, that's how important it is that we get that initial process right.
And I think we'll come back to this later this afternoon when we talk about funding and financing.
Yeah.
But one of the changes in the planning Act or planning bill is that the link to infrastructure in the spatial plan is strengthened through this. So the extent to which we have to have a better idea, forward plan of what the infrastructure is required to enable the growth that's in the spatial plan has a much stronger tie in the future to both the LTP and the water services strategy, which we aren't the decision maker on anymore, but well, we're not the developer of anymore. So we'll come back to that this afternoon because there's a lot of implications in relation to rates capping, use of IFFA, development levies, so we'll talk about all that this afternoon, but I just wanted to flag that it's important to note that that 15 months, that time is also when we're going to be doing the LGP and the water services strategy, and there's significant implications to infrastructure funding.
So thank you for that. So given that the timeframes for this, particularly because of all of this happening deliberately concurrently, so the timeframes are deliberately chaotic and in fact unattainable for anything of any quality. So that's intended, so keep that in mind, that what we get out of this will not be ideal, and the lawyers some lawyers are going to be very busy in aspects of it, back to that point. But what in the planning and natural environment bills is that we talk about infrastructure plans and 30-year spatial plans, and we've seen planning, including spatial planning here recently, and in Queenstown Lakes in particular over the last 40 years. You make provision in a plan for stuff to happen over 20 or 50 years, then it happens in 5. Is there anything in there to have growth then staged at a sustainable rate that we can actually, our communities can actually afford to fund and is socially and environmentally sustainable too? Is there anything, or is it just put it up 30 years and then whoever wants to come and do it?
I think there's the ability for council to influence the water CCO and how we do it, but it also gives the ability through fast tracks and IEF. So even though there is, so our spatial plan becomes important from a QLDC and regional perspective about what we want and what our
only where though?
Yeah,
not when.
only we, and when if we can say, we can prioritise and say, look, we want the eastern and southern corridor, that are our
We
priorities.
can?
Or, yes,
Okay.
we can.
We can establish priorities, but don't forget, you've got two key overriding things. One is you've got the fact that there's no proposals to remove the fast track legislation.
No.
And they've been quite explicit about that. And the second one is there's still the national policy standard about the amount of land, zone and service land councils have to maintain. So again, come back to the philosophy of this. This is actually, this is about changing, this is a significant philosophical change in the way that the system is run to drive development and to limit communities' ability to shape the nature of that development.
Right, so
Infrastructure can't constrain growth.
It's not allowed to
basically the
anymore.
principle that underpins a lot of it.
Right.
It's coming through in the government priority statements, coming through in the planning bill, it's coming through in the system improvements and the development levies. So there's an underlying principle of infrastructure must be planned to deliver on the expected growth.
And funded and delivered.
And funded and delivered, which is what we'll talk about this afternoon in terms of how and how those things are somewhat, in some cases, at odds with each other.
It's probably worth being honest, this is not the first time that governments have tried to connect those two together. 2015, there was quite a big review of the RMA, but effectively it finally collapsed. But this is there's a key push so that the government does not want individual parts of the system being able to be justified to hold up other parts of the system. If the overall system is about promoting growth and development, then mechanisms that, I wouldn't say hold up, but mechanisms that have traditionally slowed things down, such as funding of infrastructure, provision of infrastructure, scale and suitability, are basically being ruled out by this legislative change.
On the basis that doing that increases the cost of housing. So the underlying principle is all of this is supposed to drive a housing, a development market that delivers more housing into the market so that housing becomes more affordable. That's the actual principle at the highest principle level.
Yeah, we have a landing area over here for pigs to land.
Okay, Nicola was wanting to.
Quick one on the, given that you said we're in 15 months, do you think it's reasonable to think that we can do a sub-regional spatial plan, or should we just focus on regional?
I think it'll be easier to do a sub-regional. We've done a lot of work with Centro Otago with the regional deal, so we have we've developed through that a really great working relationship with them. And the only other thing I just before so I can go back to Anna is in terms of value capture for affordable housing, I think this is a great opportunity for us to put a submission. I know the government keeps saying, we don't do special things, but I've noted in the Act they have done special things to Auckland and Chatham Islands, so there's a precedent being set in here. But same with the fast track if councillors were open to it, I think it's a really good opportunity for us just to submit and try and get something through.
If we spent 3.5 years getting together a spatial plan into which a lot of work went, what is so flawed about that we can't continue to use that and submit that?
We can continue to use it, but I think we need to improve on it. I think that link, what we learned from that original one, we need that stronger link with infrastructure.
But we have a very good template, correct?
Yes.
I think
we're not starting.
That's an important thing to know, Jude, and that is that we're not, as much as this feels pressured and rushed, we're probably in a better situation than many councils because we actually do have, we have the work we've done on the regional deal, we have the structure plans in place, we have the sub-regional plan in place with Grow Wealth Waiora. So we do have a very solid and sound basis to work from. I think the challenge will be, as always, the higher you go in the system, the less specific you're going to be and the more irrelevant you're going to be. And I think it's as irrelevant in so much as it's going to be hard for people to see what reality looks like if you're dealing at a very high level system, which I think went back to the comment that one of the ladies made, which was, how do you actually engage the community to say that this level of awareness and engagement is important when most people don't wake up to what's happening until it happens next door to them on the property.
To be honest, I think we're just going to be here as a paid punching bag, because at the end of the day... But it's going to get worse, because we're going to have influence over outcomes, particularly the individual councillors around the table, because if the mayors are agreeing with spatial plans, which are basically the basis for everything, how much discretion do we really have through the LGP? How much discretion do we have at all? But it looks like we're doing it all.
I mean, to me, the common theme for all of these reforms are we become a local delivery organisation for national standards and policies and directions. So
we have to make
that
very
localism
clear.
is that. Quentin's got his hand up, would like to make a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Look, a lot of it's been said, but I mean, firstly, that I think that, look, we are reasonably well placed with the spatial plan, and, you know, provided it gets the teeth that it needs, then it is actually a useful tool for us. Now, there's a couple of real, you know, we've already highlighted you know, it's not just a challenge or an inconvenience, but the fast track consent bill is at complete odds with everything that is trying to be achieved through the spatial plan and the so, you know, we can't state strongly enough that the fast track consenting bill compromises everything else that we try to do from a strategic planning point of view.
Agreed.
So you know, that's an absolute given. We need to fight that as hard as it needs the teeth. If a spatial plan is going to be a spatial plan, it needs the teeth for us to enforce it. Now, the second part of it is the rural land piece. Is, you know, if we have urban areas and we can sort of contain urban areas, and then we have, you know, it's unclear as to what level of, if any, of landscape protection. Now, it's foreseeable that they might come round on ONFs and ONLs to some degree, that will be afforded some protection of those under the spatial plan. But what we do face is, and I've had this conversation with resource management professionals, is that the non ONL and ONF rural lands, of which the Wakatipu Basin, valley floor, and a large part of the Upper Clutha is unlikely to be afforded any protection. So all that work we've done on the Wakatipu Basin and the 80 hectare minimum lot sizes and the amenity zone and the precinct and everything is likely to be heavily undermined under the current framework. So yeah, there's just a couple of things to keep in mind, but they're the things that concern me the most at this point.
All right, so I just took you through some of the key changes, but obviously there's more to that. But not all proposals in the replacement bills are without concern, and these next I will outline the areas that raised really big red flags for us, but specifically for our strategic and operational and immediate, like our phones are going to be ringing. So those are the types of, immediate stuff that complete red flags, and we recommend our councillors that QLDC could consider opposing in a submission. Okay, let's dive in. So the new FX framework that I mentioned earlier in the section 14, this significantly changes how consenting decisions are assessed in our district, because at the moment we have got quite a lot of different types of landscape protections on our different types of landscapes. So we've got our outstanding natural landscapes and features, we've got rural character landscapes, and then we've got Wakatipu Basin Rural Amenity Zone, which we call it the RAS. So we've got a couple of different overlays in our district plan that are protected. And to be honest, they make what our district composes of. That's how our economy churns, because people come here for those protections and for those kind of values. Since the new FX framework introduced in the section 14 narrowly defines the scope of effects for land use decisions, For instance, we won't be able to necessarily protect, as Councillor Quinton mentioned, any character-related stuff, they won't be a thing. So visual amenity, royal character, character heritage, these are not going to be protected under the new proposed system. We've got, okay, so this is another kind of QLDC specific point. When we look at the other planning regimes in other districts, you don't really have 97% of your land area being an ONFL. So this is particularly challenging for Queenstown Lakes District. It might not be a massive deal for Wellington or, I don't know, Porua or someone like that, but it is definitely something that we need to really be cognizant about. So we've got some, I can flag you some operational reputational issues. So section 14 will apply 1 month after the royal assent of this bill turning into act. So basically, if this bill goes through as an act, we are supposed to apply this narrow effect framework immediately to our consenting before even the transition process from RMA to the bill continues. So what that means is that most of our PDP provisions almost will be like kind of not legal. So we'll be asked to operate in a system that narrows those effects. But then at the end of the day, we also have our PDP proposed district plan, which we have lots of rules and provisions for that we're protecting these landscapes. So we've got this immediate operational issue where our phones will be ringing and going, from land users, landowners and developers, like, you're not supposed to protect that framework. You're not supposed to assess that framework. You're not supposed to, So we will have all of that, which creates an operational issue for us immediately, which we will ask for a clarification probably from the ministry, because we do have quite a lot of rules protecting those overlays at the moment.
Where do we go in all of this with all the plan appeals that are still outstanding? I mean, we've got plan appeals that we're still mediating or opposing or spending legal fees on. What value, maybe not for now, but what's the value of that spend right now in this context?
Yeah.
A rhetorical question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I can't quantify it at this point in time, but we've got significantly less. We're down to the last appeals that we're resolving at the moment. We're in a pretty good space to make all of the proceeding stages up pretty soon.
I think, however, what Honor has just described about how Section 14 will take effect on this district, that's like the reaction you've had around the fast track on steroids. Because the council, and you've all had it to varying degrees, councillors and staff, will effectively be blamed for why am I suddenly not able to achieve the outcome I thought I'd be protected from. So that's probably, that's an important point that we need to push back on, that sort of, that approach, and B, the timing of that approach and the consequences for local government.
There's going to be a lot of people sit on their hands with an application until the middle of this year.
Oh, absolutely.
And then there's going to be an avalanche of applications.
So you have two things.
Once the bill comes
why aren't you doing it? And why aren't you stopping it? There are two immovable forces which will be ground between.
Oh, and yeah.
Should we just give everyone the local member of parliament's email address?
Absolutely right.
That's going to be.
Pass them to now.
It's the upward funnel.
I think operationally, you're going to have to be ready for an avalanche of applications that are going to come 1 month
The only good thing is there won't be much evaluation on them.
Correct.
The thing is, we're talking about it like it's a done deal, despite the fact that it's a bill and it's going through a submission process, and that's a problem, because I think until it's happened, I think we need to push back. I think we can say to the community, this is what's coming. If you don't want it, push back.
Thinking we need our Mark Carney middle powers moment.
I mean, I know why we're assuming that, because everything is just, I know. But if we say we're not going to stop, this is a blue,
Yeah, I think the key thing though, Nikki, is that, we are, what we're trying to say is these are things we should be pushing back on. But you're right, the community, if they really feel strongly, need to push back on that as well. I mean, all things being equal, this government has an absolute majority in the House. So all things being equal, it will get ultimately what it wants. But unless we do say things like this, and unless central local government does, there will be no change. So these are ones that I think this group that we're going through are things that we've identified as being of significant risk to our community and to the district. So they are ones that we should be pushing back on strongly.
I think some of this goes back to the point I made earlier, though, that the economic drivers here are imperative. So if these changes are going to mean that aspects of the economy of Queenstown Lakes, which is critical to the national economy, are put at risk because of this permissive approach, then we can push back on that. It's happened in Auckland. The Prime Minister has given direction that, we'll water it down a bit. So, and that's really important. The other thing too is that although, yes, the coalition does have a majority, of course, but there are negotiations underway between, in particular, National and Labor to try and come up with a bill that will get through Parliament that won't then be changed radically when some later time there's a change in government. So this is an opportunity to make those arguments rationally, particularly around economic drivers, with a mind to what the other parties might think, because this area is actually so important. It is a middle power.
Don't forget though, I mean, whilst this is more extreme in some context, it is not actually completely at odds with what the last Labor government was doing with its revised legislation. So some of this, there is this general force of change in both across government that actually, reduces the scope and the complexity. What they see is scope and complexity and involvement. And I think, John, you said, we are becoming more of an organ of central government delivery. That's been a pathway local government has been on probably for the last decade. So that's not changing irrespective of actually who's in power.
Yeah, that's right. Like the bills were in the Labor time, they were bipartisan. So maybe you won't see regulatory relief or something like that, but the essence is they're going to go through with the premise of it. Just wanted to highlight you might wonder what that image is about. So that is the Wibras, Wakatipu Basin Rural Amenity Zone overlay. It shows you the capacity for use and development. So the dark red is no capacity, to kind of the lighter colours would tell you like there will be some capacity for development. So it tells you how serious this stuff is for our district, those protections. So if we remove them, we'll be having development in places where we don't necessarily desire. That could undermine our district's economy and identity as well. So this is not just about a couple of overlays and protecting them. It's about actually protecting our economy and also what QLDC is and its identity. So that's a big one. The second big one is the regulatory relief, the famous notorious child of this the proposed bill. The planning bill proposed regulatory relief. So this is basically from government's better planning page. So when considering controls relating to significant historic heritage, indigenous biodiversity, outstanding natural features and landscapes, coastal areas and waterways with high natural character and site of significance to Māori, councils must justify this application of the controls to each site, consider the impact of those controls, proactively identify and set out regulatory relief mechanisms, and allowing landowners to access regulatory relief through a range of mechanisms, including rates reductions, bonus development rights, and cash. So this is basically what the government is proposing.
And I guess the obvious one is rates cap on one side and then also pay for everything on the other side. Have they seen the irony in there? It's in the way. They're not related.
So, and this part of Section 92, we talk about the topic and entitlements where the rule has significant impact on the reasonable use of land. So that's going to keep the lawyers busy for the next 10, 20 years in terms of what it is. So, there's a process through this.
Reasonable in relation to the underlying zone that applies.
Well, that's what I would hope.
You would think so.
Yeah. So then if a rural zone was providing for rural activities and those could continue, you've still got your reasonable use.
So there's
Could make things a lot clearer.
Yeah.
So there's no suggestion that if we're using the new zones just to reaffirm what's already there, that doesn't trigger this relief. So it's already ONL, and we get, let's say, by some miracle, we get an ONL cookie cutter zone that we put on. Does that trigger regulatory relief, or is it no change?
It will do it, the plan making process.
Yeah, it may well do trigger. That's one of the clarifications we have. We're looking at retrospective triggering of regulatory relief because it's not clear through the legislation because it's so rushed about many of the really big questions we have that can have a significant impact to our community. For people that have land now that's under ONL, for any rules to be changed moving forward from standby zones, regulatory relief is talked about in terms of having to do this, but the specifics and the real tricky questions are the ones we're going to be hoping to submit on if we're supported by you, of course, to do that.
So where does the legal concept in land use of pre-existing use rights apply? So if controls don't exist anymore and new controls then anything that even is the same as before is deemed to be new. So does that apply to existing uses, or are they all extinguished too, and they have to then fit what the new plan says?
Well, that's actually the next point.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. There's definitely, our interpretation currently, from a technical planning perspective, that could apply to a retrospective thing, because the national, the government will set up those sort of like criteria for the ONFLs to be identified. So then we need to give effect to that, and that criteria will create a new ONFL, which we will be asked to create a relief framework for.
Wow.
So the strategic risk is that, as mentioned, 97% of QLDC land is protected by the ONFLs, and this creates billions of dollars in potential fiscal exposure because a lot of people can come and ask for it.
Just to try and round out John's question. So if we had an ONL set of standards up here, yes, we got a new standard ONFL zone. If that's then set there, we could be subject to regulatory relief anything higher than what the new zone actually allows.
How does rates keeping work with that?
Well, we would have to find a way to fund that.
Yeah,
I know. I mean, the question is really fine. Yeah, but that's.
So it's only if you're going above what the basic minimum
you would have to. Otherwise, there's no logic to how you would manage the change.
Yeah.
So I think the expectation would be that you would either abandon what is over and above what the new zone provides for, or there would be a process for you to have to test and demonstrate why you had that higher level, and potentially that could be subject to the regulatory relief rules.
and that's section 89, which is that justification report that council will have to.
But it doesn't work the other way, though, does it? So if an outstanding natural feature or landscape, that being protected, increases the value of the property, do they then need to pay us a bonus?
That's a fair question. Well, I think that's been one of the core underlying principles of the system, right, to date, that any land use zone, it basically creates value and it takes value. And the two are not tradable. What we've got is a shift that says actually it is a tradable process if it's an imposition on what you could do, and that is a very strong philosophical base of at least a number of ministers in this government that says fundamentally you should be allowed to do exactly what you want to do, and any imposition above what is reasonable is compensated.
You know what? I mean, we're writing a submission. We're writing it to the government to change the law, but of the direction of the legislation. But obviously, we're all going. It's going to go through anyway. Are we writing the submission as much to speak to our community and explain?
What the consequences
I mean, this stuff should be highlighted clearly.
Absolutely, and because there's also so many questions we still have that to be able to operate effectively in strategic plan and plan for LTP development, How much money do we put aside? How does that work? How much is it going to cost us in litigation for every party in the district who wants to challenge us in terms of regulatory relief, because there might be something in it.
Because they're
for
just
them.
switching the challenge from the rules to the regulatory relief in a way. I mean, is it really going to cost us any less?
So,
It's going to cost us more because there's a payout at the end of it as well.
and I think,
except the government probably is doing it, well, likely is doing it because they want us to abandon the higher standard. And that's why they're putting in place the regulatory relief, not because they want councils to spend more money. They don't, because they're capping our rates. What they want us to do is say, we can't afford to do this, so therefore we'll drop the higher standard so people can do more with their land.
Deliberate choice.
so, so just a couple of last things to basically kind of make that point there. So, because we've got 97% of our land is protected by our ONFLs, and because this is also going to be directed by the national level standards as well, it puts us into a really awkward position that we must protect them, but we must also go to ratepayers' pocket to pay some people to justify that protection. So it's philosophically, you know, as a government principle, governance principle, it seems quite odds with that, which is kind of feeding into that enjoyment of land development goal of the bill. So it's kind of like it's got its pull and push happening here. But there's a serious natural justice concerns because, litigation is likely to be increased. And
There's almost a constitutional challenge.
Yes, correct.
Imposing a duty on local authorities.
That's right.
To do something.
To pay someone to.
Right.
So that's I think one of the really biggest parts that I invite you to think about in a few. So that's the natural justice part where someone is seeking some relief for their stuff, but actually that goes from Joe Block's pocket. To pay for that because that's what's going to happen.
So it doesn't align with the rationale for the rest of it, does it?
Do you think they put shit in there so that?
Right word.
But like, if you go, okay, we'll just focus on that because we've got to get rid of that, and then all the other stuff becomes easier to digest. Could be part of it.
We'll give you this, but we'll keep this.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of that. You throw enough up, then.
Well, that's the chaos theory, right?
But also the regulatory relief, is that really coming from one smaller section of the coalition government? And if we push back hard enough, that might be withdrawn given that it's election year and they're not tying themselves together, maybe?
Yeah.
Like to think?
Yeah. It would depend on a few things. It would depend on the impact on other locations in the country, whether it's going to be significant as it is here. And I would say it's probably not. So they're not probably thinking about the implications here, but it's also about the clarifications we receive when we ask these questions. So how's this going to work? Does this mean if a neighbour says that their development rights are impugned by something we've done on the neighbouring land, they can apply for regulatory relief? And there's no clarity in there in relation to how it's going to work. It may well be something that could come out of this, which is why we're saying we should focus on this as one of the key aspects of our submission. But also it is fundamental in driving the government's need to increase development rights for everyone and to stop councils reducing those development rights.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
I've got two more slides that are sort of the challenging areas. The next one is the permitted activity framework. So the bill introduces a permitted activity rules framework, which represents a major shift toward a more permissive system. We talked about that, allowing many activities to proceed as of right, provided that it adhere to national standards with specific local requirements. So under the new system, the registration of permitted activity acts as a gatekeeping process where the council must verify specific criteria are met before the activity can lawfully proceed without a consent. And under a different section of this bill, a person must notify the authority in writing describing how they meet the rules conditions, and the authority, which is us, has the 10 working days to determine if the conditions are met, and if so, register the activity and begin monitoring it. Now, we do not have such thing at the moment in our current systems. We don't monitor permitted activities under the RMA, and we do not have FDs to do this. And whereas what this is saying is you must have a new team of people and then register all of the permitted activities coming to your door, and then register them do paperwork, do red tape, and then also start monitoring it with your other set of teams who are doing monitoring. The framework is designed to reduce the volume of planning consents by ensuring that activities meeting standard requirements and are subject to an upfront consenting process, but it's creating whole another cost to council business and potentially a sort of, again, a fiscal liability for us, because we do not perform this at the moment, and it requires a whole bunch of thinking to how do we introduce this into our council functions.
So this is like the current and new provision for secondary dwellings. If they comply.
Yeah, they must go ahead and permit it.
But they still have to register it.
Correct, yeah.
But if something's permitted, presumably there's no fees that we can charge for somebody for doing something.
You can recoup it, but I think the amount of permitted activities will just is going to go beyond and above.
And it's also a fundamental way of thinking. If you're permitted to do something, you don't have to go through red tape to ensure that I'm still permitted to do that, and potentially pay for the privilege.
Yeah.
Right, so even
so somebody's are saying, you're permitted, but we actually still need to register it and monitor it.
And apply a test as to whether it is actually permitted.
And it's actually happening.
Again, so it's another bureaucratic step.
It's sort of similar to what we do for a code of compliance, which is a resource consent. So anybody
and that can be quite expensive.
It also can be, because you have to do quite a lot of work to establish that.
It is helpful for the second homes though to be able to recover the DCs.
For that, but it works. But
and on earthworks and things like that, you can't just go and do something. Everybody,
you're going to dig a hole for your garden.
You're going to dig a hole. You've got to come and say, "Hey, this is a hole."
Even beyond that, and the more clarification we're looking for is that, as it's currently written, it may be that we're going to charge you to go to your house and see what you haven't done over the last 3 years. So that's a major issue, and we need clarification, because they've said a 3-yearly cycle of monitoring in district of sites to understand permitted activities that have been undertaken, not undertaken. We need to get into the detail of that and say, well, actually, this doesn't make any sense. We're not going to charge our community, everybody, fees to go and monitor their sites to check that they haven't done anything.
They haven't thought this through.
So, okay. It's just got to do with the rush in this legislation. Getting through.
The last one, but not least, the existing land users and explained into section 20. This is a really interesting one in the RMA context or in the district plans. We don't necessarily sort of talk about existing use rights in our plans, because it kind of goes into all sorts of rabbit holes. Again, it could be a subjective thing. But this bill particularly introduces an existing use right section. So the section 20 of the planning bill outlines the framework grandfathered land use rights, allowing established activities to continue even when new rules are introduced that would otherwise prohibit them. So a person may continue to use land in a manner that contravenes a new national rule, and a rule in a land use plan or a proposed rule with legal effect without needing a new planning consent if the use was lawfully established and was a permitted activity or otherwise legal before the new rule came into force, or the effects of the use remained the same or similar in character, intensity, and scale to those that existed before the new rule. So why this is challenging in practice? So it needs to have a robust proof of lawful establishment is required. Also the funnel, we talked about the funnel, that aims for national consistency, but the section 20 gives you inherently preserves local and non-compliant bits of land to do stuff. And national standards will need to balance consistency with fair transitional treatment. But this could particularly become problematic, as I've put the picture on the new national pulse statement for natural hazards 2025, where, for instance, if a hazard risk on a piece of parcel, a piece of land is very high, you must avoid any land use and development. So with an existing use right, you can say, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not doing anything. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay. So this puts us into a really interesting position where you've got a whole bunch of people who could argue that they've got lawfully established and legally established user rights, and it could go above what is set at the national level.
Sorry, how does section 20 differ from the current section 10 of the existing use rights provisions in the current legislation.
I think
So what we're interested in is where's the difference? We've always had something like this.
yeah.
So where does this take us that the LEUR don't?
I think I see this as the implementation. We don't really go there in the district plans to acknowledge this in our plan chapters, whereas because we will be using the bill for existing use rights and not in the way that the RMA actually reflected them in the plans. I see this as a sort of a grandfather rights could actually, you know, particularly be negative of some of the other things that the system is going to do, especially the national direction process that we just got.
I think in terms of existing use rights, you've got the onus to prove that you're lawfully established. Mm-hmm. So that's quite a sometimes a pretty high bar. But we have, the way I read this rule is there's this part of the Act is there's this sort of 12-month period under subsection 3 that if you haven't been using the land in that existing permitted framework before this bill comes into force as an Act, then you can't do it. But if you have been continuously doing something that was a permitted activity that was lawfully established, you're good to go. But you've got that 12-month transition period, which is a continuous period, which would be really difficult for us to sort of monitor. That's when it doesn't apply. The Section 20 type stuff doesn't apply if you haven't had that continuous use for that.
And that's not 12 months from the date of inception of the Act. That's only 12 months ahead of when
the rule came into force, unless you got an extension.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's yeah.
Yeah. RMA doesn't have those. Yeah. Like I think interactions between the nationally set documents, where I think this makes really clear that how it applies to a rule.
Yeah.
Is that like a ratchet clause, sort of like if they overlay it to be easier, you're caught by, I know, not in your circumstance, but you get it anyway. So all of that.
Yeah, it could be interpreted that way. Yeah, yeah. That's how we're seeing it at the moment. But this could be also a clarification point as well. But if it is how we're interpreting it, it probably creates a whole bunch of issues with other instruments, other things that we want to achieve. And I see it particularly with the NPS, natural hazards, new NPS, as quite directive. It gives councils to actually push off development if the hazard risk is really high. So for instance, you know, like you can go back to someone and say, sorry, you've got established rights, but I'm going to, you know, because you've got this massive risk that you can't be there. So I think it kind of is just encouraging those things that are already in high conflict and quite dangerous place to go in.
Section 10 helps us in that regard, that Anish's pointed me to in terms of existing uses to land that you work with Section 20 as well. So that's something that we can include in any submission if you wish.
So that was us, and just the last point here, whether you see any of these topics being a submission point, do you agree or disagree with any of the things that we talked about, or do you want to talk about some other things that we haven't maybe forwarded out to you, and additional questions, concerns? Yeah, happy to sort of open the floor for your thoughts, because yeah, we will be hand-holding the submission, and yeah, want to make sure that you are happy with those points.
Just a quick synopsis of some of the things we've talked about here, so you can bring them up, or if it's not in here, maybe mention it, so we make sure we capture the advice from you in relation to submission. We talked about provenance and how that can maybe control different zone requirements, predominantly regarding density, I would say, because that's the part that can impact us the most. The need to obviously discuss the fast track bill and the fact that it's so at odds with our spatial planning. We need to state that the other matters relating to spatial planning, regional planning, sub-regional planning, how the provisions might work for us is something bespoke, particularly because the regional deal requirements we already have. In terms of rural land, yeah, look, that was one of the key parts we brought up, the Section 14 changes, different changes to RCLs, all the landscape character that we have, the issues in relation to economics on that for our district and the survival of our district. We also have timing of Section 14, where we want to ask some questions in relation to how specifically that works for, and zoning as well, I think was a key point there. How does the Section 14 change work in relation to putting zonings in place? We have regulatory relief. It's obviously to discuss some of the significant issues we raised here in relation to regulatory relief and the issues that might have for long-term strategic planning for LTP planning. How we need to get clarifications also in terms of how regulatory is actually going to work, because we don't understand it from what we've been provided at this point. And also raise issues in relation to the last two matters brought up, permitted developments and how that's going to work in terms of how councils can operationally manage what's being put in the legislation about permitted developments and the point about existing use rights. So quickly, they were just the things that I've been pulling from here, but there may be others you want to just highlight for the team over the next few minutes.
I might have missed that, but did you include anything in there about the future role of governments?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Sorry,
first
I
one.
missed
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Good job.
That's some serious work over summer. Thank you so much.
Summer.
That's why the drowning rate reduced. The bad weather and planners being busy.
Okay, is there anything burning around the table? Apart from all our rules and plans and everything we've worked for the last 20 years. If not, we'll call a break. We've got some lunch. I think we're back on deck at 1 o'clock.
Great.
Thank you very much. Please reach out. I've got my email address. If you want to go into details in the middle, happy to answer you.